Rome and its people are arguably the most well-known, well-studied, and most influential political entity and corresponding people in human history. Essentially, since the Roman Empire fell, regardless of when you believe that actually happened, Rome has been studied, and countless historians, archaeologists, and ethnographers have dedicated their careers to learning and documenting all they possibly can on Rome and its people. Its heroes, symbols, legends, and history have influenced the Western world in a way that basically no other civilization has been able to do. Because of our deep knowledge of the subject, it really shouldn't be all that surprising that some of the knowledge has fallen to the wayside in favor of the more interesting and documented heroes and events in Roman history. Today's video will attempt to bring some of those less talked about but no less interesting aspects of Roman history to your attention. To facilitate that goal, the format of this video will be based around the ever so popular iceberg. An internet iceberg is a collection of various pieces of information collected into a tiered system, with the most popular and well-known pieces of information at the top, and thus the visible part of the iceberg, and the less known pieces of information further towards the bottom of the iceberg, the portion which you cannot see. While you will likely know most of what is contained in the first few tiers of this iceberg, it is my hope that I can introduce you to some of the more mysterious, but just as interesting aspects of Roman history that you may or may not know much about. So sit back, grab a snack, and enjoy. A quick disclaimer. I will not be going super in-depth with many of these people, events, and so on. If you want more in-depth videos, let me know by commenting down below. Also, there are simply too many sources for me to list them in the description. If you want my sources or recommendations for further reading in any of these topics, then please comment down below as well, and I'll be happy to give you either. This video is also a conglomeration of my own thoughts and a few of the already made icebergs out there. Feel free to use it for whatever purposes you want. Thanks, now back to the video. Starting with everyone's favorite Roman, the man, the myth, the legend, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar is without a doubt the most famous Roman in history. His name is synonymous with Rome. He is to Rome what men like Alexander or George Washington were to Greece and the United States respectively. Caesar was born into an aristocratic Roman family, called a gens in ancient Rome, known as the Julia family. His family had been a patrician family of Rome since the time of the Roman kings in the 7th century BCE. His family was actually so influential that they were believed to be connected to the legendary founder of the Latin city-states, Aeneas, through his son, Anchises. Caesar was far from the first in his family to ascend the Roman political ladder. His family had produced consuls, consular tribunes, dictators, praetors, and, well, I think you get the point. The Julia family had at one point or another occupied basically every office that was available to the patricians of Rome. Caesar, though, would outshine them all. Caesar's political career is long and storied. We sadly don't have time to talk about everything the man did. We would be here for hours if we tried. But here are the highlights. Caesar was appointed to the College of Pontiffs, the highest-ranking assembly of Roman priests, in 73 BCE, upon the death of his relative, Gaius Aurelius Cauda. Caesar used this position as a springboard to become a military tribune in 71 BCE, and then ascend to a quaestorship in 69 BCE. In following with the cursus honorum, the blueprint for Roman patricians to ascend the political ladder, Caesar was elected aedile in 65 BCE, and in 63 BCE, Caesar was elected Pontifex Maximus, the highest Roman priesthood, and praetor at the same time. This was probably unprecedented, and either points towards Caesar already showing generational amounts of promise, or an impressive bribery scheme on behalf of Caesar. Our ancient sources, and our modern-day sources, are split on which. Caesar would finally ascend to Rome's highest office in 59 BCE, alongside Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. Caesar would be elected to serve his first term as consul. It was during this time Caesar would create the famous First Triumvirate alongside Pompey and Crassus that would dominate Roman politics for decades to come. Following his term as consul, Caesar was assigned to be the governor of two Roman provinces, Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. He would further be granted the province of Transalpine Gaul upon the unexpected death of its governor in the same year. Caesar would use these new positions as a springboard to conquer all of Gaul, roughly modern-day France. Caesar would not only conquer these lands in the name of Rome, but also, at least in a way, in his own name. He would make a massive amount of money from the various battles and campaigns, secure the loyalty of several Roman legions, and be able to grant citizenship and political benefits to a new class of people in Gaul, thus securing their loyalty in the Roman political system. It was the power gained from these Gallic wars that gave Caesar both the actual physical power and the confidence to start his civil war, a war that he would eventually win, and with his victory, ascend to become an emperor in all but name. His victory, alongside his untimely assassination, would put the nail in the coffin for the Roman Republic and give way to the Roman Empire. Caesar's name and his actions are quite possibly the most important of any Roman in history. He changed the course of Roman history, for better or worse, and his influence is felt even in the modern day. Truly, Caesar is worthy of his legendary status, and it is fitting that our examination started with the person many, including most of history's Romans, consider to be the greatest Roman to ever live. The Roman Republic was Rome's form of government from about 509 BCE until Augustus's rise in 27 BCE. The Republic came about following the overthrow of Rome's kings in 509 BCE and served as the period of Roman history whereby most of Rome's conquest and development happened. The Roman Republic was essentially in a state of near constant war. From Gaul to Spain to North Africa to Greece and Egypt, Rome fought, lost, and won throughout this period of Roman history. The Punic Wars, the Pyrrhic War, the Macedonian Wars, along with several civil wars, all occurred during this period. The Roman Republic is in many ways the foundation stone of Roman history, and many of Rome's traditions, legends, and myths have their start in the Republican period. Augustus, born as Gaius Octavius and known as Octavian for most of his life, was Rome's first emperor, or imperator, and the great-nephew and eventual adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian was born into the Octavia gens, and his mother, Atia, was the niece of Caesar. Octavian was a sickly youth, and he would never be quite able to shake these illnesses. He was never a military mind. Because of this, he was often dismissed by most of the Roman aristocracy. However, what Octavian lacked in military genius, he more than made up for in his speaking ability and his masterful administrative and political mind. Octavian was a genius. While he may not have been able to defeat his enemy on the battlefield, very few could match him in the political theater. Luckily for Octavian, he would meet a lifelong friend during his schooling years. This friend, Marcus Agrippa, would serve as Octavian's military genius and masterclass general. Together, the two men would work like a well-oiled machine, and we'll talk a little bit more about Agrippa later in this video. When his uncle died, Octavian was shocked to find that he was listed as Caesar's heir in Caesar's will. Octavian would inherit Caesar's name, fortune, and even to an extent the loyalty of his legions. Octavian would use these newly found resources to establish himself as a leading force in Roman politics, and over the course of the next couple of decades, he would fight a few civil wars and destroy several rivals, before being named Augustus. This title and name would be passed on to Rome's successive emperors, and essentially granted the holder a quasi-divine status. Augustus would become Rome's first and one of its greatest emperors. He would be the first emperor to be granted his own cult, and his actions and use of powers would go on to set precedents that would influence the Roman emperors for centuries. Despite not being Caesar's true biological son, Augustus lived up to the name of his adopted father and transformed Rome into his own image. Roman myths are heavily influenced by Greek myth. This is because the early versions of Rome, the Roman kingdom, and even the Roman Republic fell under the influence of the Greeks basically from their founding. Roman religion is almost a one-for-one copy of Greek religion, just with the names changed. There are some exceptions to this rule, and we'll talk about that a little later, but Jupiter is Zeus, Neptune is Poseidon, Pluto is Hades, and so on. We even see this influence in Rome's founding myth, the Aeneid. Again, something we will talk about in a little bit. It's really understandable for the Romans to want to adopt Greek myth. After all, in Rome's infancy, Greek culture was much more advanced, and it was connected to this rich history, something that Rome had always valued. It was probably pretty easy for a developed system of religion and myth to usurp whatever local practices the Romans first held, and the rest is, well, history, I guess. Byzantium's importance in Roman history is twofold. Firstly, Byzantium was the original Greek name for Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul. The city itself was founded sometime in the 7th century BCE by Greek settlers. The city would never be as influential as, say, Sparta or Athens, but it would serve as an important regional hub, and its geographic position had the potential to turn the city into one of the most important in the entire Mediterranean. This would happen when the city was refounded as Constantinople, named after the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great in 324 AD. Constantinople would go on to be the center of the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes known as the Byzantine Empire, and would serve as a sort of successor city to Rome itself when Rome was lost to that empire. Constantinople would serve at various points in European history as the center of culture, religion, and the economy. Its position on the crossroads between the Middle East and Europe served to enrich the city and its holders beyond belief. And even today, it serves as one of the most important cities in the world. The second part of the importance of Byzantium is in its role as the alternative name for the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire, as it was most popularly known, was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and it would outlast its western counterpart by centuries. It would last from the first division of the empire in 286 AD all the way until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans. And while we may refer to it as a separate empire, its citizens and rulers continued to call themselves the Roman Empire all the way until the fall of Constantinople. And even as late as the 19th century, some Greeks referred to Greece as Romica, reflecting the deeply held belief that the Byzantine Empire was really the Roman Empire. One of the most asked questions in the study of Roman history, and one of my favorites. The date for the fall of Rome has been a topic heavily debated for centuries. The first date would be 476 AD, and this year the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustus, was forced to abdicate his throne by the German king Odoacer. However, we could even say that this date is inaccurate, as it seems as though Odoacer actually ruled Italy in cooperation with the Roman Senate, and ethnic Romans were given positions of importance within the bureaucracy of his kingdom. There is even some evidence that Odoacer attempted to serve as a subordinate king under Zeno, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. However, most historians generally agree that 476 was the date that the western half of the Roman Empire fell. Notice, though, that I only say the western half. This is because, of course, over in Greece, Constantinople to be precise, Zeno still ruled the eastern half of the empire. The eastern half had really been the more prosperous and senior half of the empire for a few centuries now, and despite being much more Greek than the Western Roman Empire, it was still technically the Roman Empire. The emperor was titled as the Roman Emperor, the imperial regalia were transferred to Constantinople upon the abdication of Romulus Augustulus, and the people in the empire still considered themselves Roman. If we consider the Eastern Roman Empire to actually be Roman, which by all accounts we should, then the date shifts considerably forward to 1453 AD. It was in this year that the Ottoman Turks finally succeeded in conquering Constantinople, and with it ended the Roman Empire. Or did they? Well, if we move forward just a little bit more to the year 1461 AD, then we have the surrender of Gradistas Palaiologos, the despot of Morea. Gradistas was the last ruler of the House of Palaiologos, the imperial house that had ruled over the Byzantine Empire for almost 200 years, from 1259 to 1453. So technically, the despot of Morea was the last ruler from the empire that had been the Byzantine Empire, which had been the Eastern Roman Empire, which had been the Roman Empire. So then, is this the last date for the fall of Rome? Well, no. Actually, Mehmed II, the ruler of the Ottoman Turks that had conquered Constantinople, actually claimed the title of Caesar following his victory. Mehmed would actually view his conquest not as a replacement of the great Roman Empire, but a continuation, and would see himself as the Roman Emperor, a title he would pass to his heirs. So if we follow that title, then the last holder of the title of Roman Emperor would be Abdulmajid II, the last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who was deposed in 1944. If we want to make this even more complicated, let's turn our attention back to the West. You see, there was this super famous empire called the Holy Roman Empire. Well, The emperor of that empire was crowned as the Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. This title was first used in 800 AD by Charlemagne and would be used until 1806 when the empire was dissolved. The point here is that this question is extremely complicated, despite being one of the most asked questions when studying Rome. In fact, Mary Beard, who is one of the greatest Roman historians in my opinion, makes a fascinating argument that Rome never actually fell. It lives on in our fascination with the history, our use of Latin, our traditions, and of course in the titles of so many monarchs in extremely recent history. This is all to say that really I think this question doesn't have a clean answer. Yes, you can say that 476 is the answer, and really it's hard to argue against that claim. After all, the city of Rome at this point would pass out of the possession of the emperors, and it basically would never return. I would certainly not fault anyone for arguing such a point. However, I think the question goes deeper than that, and I think that there is no clear answer to this question. Cicero is another extremely famous Roman. Cicero is a Roman famous for attributes and feats that aren't really commonly associated with great Romans. Caesar, Pompey, Scipio Africanus, and even Augustus to a certain extent are revered for their military capacity, or at least the wars they fought. Cicero, on the other hand, is famous for his ability to speak and his academic pursuits. Yes, just like any good highborn Roman, he led armies and at least had a basic understanding in military matters. But Cicero is one of history's greatest orators and academics. His written Latin works represented 3/4 of all Latin literature written during his lifetime. His influence on oratory was so significant that most historians agree that basically all prose written in European languages until the 19th century was a reaction to or based on Cicero's styles. Cicero was born into an equestrian family in 106 BCE. Cicero had some sort of birth defect, we aren't quite sure what, but it was enough to make it so that at birth he had basically no hope of entering Roman political life. Because of this, Cicero immersed himself in his studies. He traveled the Mediterranean world, going from Italy to Greece to Asia Minor, all in the hopes of furthering his studies. He studied under men such as Quintus Mucius Scaevola Arger, one of Rome's greatest legal minds, Antiochus of Ascalon, a great Greek philosopher, and Apollonius Maulon, a great orator who is said to have laid the seeds in Cicero's mind that would blossom to his great oratory skill. Upon his coming of age, Cicero made his way into politics, not through military matters, but through his incredible public speaking skills and his skill in law. Cicero would go on to hold every office in Rome at the youngest age possible, and become one of, if not the, most influential man in Rome at the time. He would sadly be executed after speaking out against the Second Triumvirate and Caesar one too many times. Cicero is probably my favorite Roman of all time, and he will almost certainly get his own series of videos looking more in depth at his life. Agrippa is a figure that I wish got more love and more attention in the study of Roman history. Marcus Vespasius Agrippa was born somewhere in Italy to a plebeian family. His family, while decently well off, was not active in Roman political life, and lived a mostly quiet series of lifetimes in the Roman countryside. At some point, Agrippa was sent off to be educated in Greek studies at Apollonia, a Greek city in modern-day Albania. The city was a center of Greek learning in the Roman world, and just so happened to be the same place that a young man named Gaius Octavius was sent to right around the same time. The two boys would meet and become quick friends, and with permission from Caesar himself, the two would continue to study together. Agrippa complimented Octavian almost perfectly. Whereas Octavian barely knew what side of the sword to hold, Agrippa was a natural-born commander. He would go on to serve as Octavian's right-hand man. When Octavian needed a military victory, Agrippa was right there to lead, and typically would win whatever battle was in question. Agrippa was unquestionably loyal to Octavian, and this loyalty is really the reason he gets overshadowed. Despite Agrippa being the driving force behind the victories of Octavian's armies, it was Octavian who received the credit. After all, Octavian was the emperor, not Agrippa. While this would make most men jealous, Agrippa didn't really seem to mind all that much, and despite being given several opportunities to do so, Agrippa never turned on his first friend. and he was rewarded because of it. Agrippa was allowed to marry Octavian's only daughter, Julia. And yeah, I know, it's definitely a bit weird. Further, he was granted Imperium Proconsulare Maius, a type of imperium that actually made him Octavian's equal in all but name. In fact, by the time that Octavian, now called Augustus, became emperor, Agrippa essentially served as a sort of junior emperor. Any time that Augustus left Rome, Agrippa was put in charge. Augustus needed someone to go negotiate with some enemy or ally of Rome? Well, let's send Agrippa. While Augustus was without a doubt the man in charge, Agrippa was without a doubt the number 2 man in Rome. Honestly, if he had outlived Augustus, it may have been Agrippa who would have been the second emperor of Rome. Sadly, though, it was not to be, and Agrippa died in 12 BCE while in Campania. Augustus himself would oversee the education of Agrippa's children, and Agrippa would be buried in Augustus's own mausoleum. Agrippa was really the driving force behind Augustus, and without him, then Caesar's heir would have never ascended to the heights that he did. The kings of Rome referred to a total of 7 different men: Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullius Hostilius, Ansus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. These men ruled over Rome from the foundation of the city in 753 BCE until the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, commonly called Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown in 509 BCE. The kings were absolute monarchs, and each left behind a legacy that would influence Roman political life for centuries to come. From Romulus literally founding the city, to Servius Tullius instituting the first census, the kings are said to be the originators for many of the most important Roman traditions. However, many modern historians question whether or not these kings existed at all. The historical records from Rome's founding and much of its early years were destroyed in the Gallic sack of Rome in 387 BCE, and because of that, many of these kings are viewed as possibly simply legends, passed down in an oral tradition, and not actually grounded in historical sources. I've actually already done a whole series on each king of Rome, where I go much more in depth with each, so if you want to check those out, I'll leave a link to them in the description. Barbarian is a term that we hear and see thrown around a lot in Roman history. The word actually comes from the ancient Greeks, who used the word to refer to any group of people who did not practice Greek customs or speak Greek. The popular story is that many of these non-Greek languages sounded like gibberish to the ancient Greeks, and were represented by the words bar. We don't really know if this is actually true, but the Greeks used the word barbarian to refer to Egyptians, Persians, Medes, and Phoenicians, and well, many more. It seems as though that the word, at least at first, didn't hold a necessarily negative connotation. Instead, it was just a word used to describe civilizations and peoples who were not Greek. However, over time, especially after the wars with Persia, barbarian began to be used as a negative term that described someone who was lesser, or at least less civilized, than the Greeks. The Romans, again falling under the influence of the Greeks, began to borrow the word as they encountered more and more peoples outside of Italy. The word was used by the Romans most often as a sort of slur to describe uncivilized people. The Romans used the word for a whole host of different peoples, including, but not limited to, the Berbers, Germanics, Celts, Iberians, Thracians, Illyrians, and Sarmatians. The Punic Wars were a series of 3 conflicts fought between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire between 264 and 146 BCE. These wars were fought as the Roman Republic established its control over the Italian mainland, and eventually came to threaten the Carthaginian control over the island of Sicily. This tension boiled over into the First Punic War. I really can't get too deep into the conflicts, as each war could easily make a video on its own. But here are the highlights. Each war resulted in a Roman victory, and each time Rome took more and more land as their spoils. In the first war, Rome took the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. In the second, Rome took all of Carthage's remaining overseas territories, mostly made up of territory in Spain, as well as the Balearic Islands. Carthage was also subordinated under Rome politically. The Carthaginian army was limited in size, and not allowed to possess any of its famous war elephants. And the Carthaginian state was prohibited from waging war outside of Africa, and only within Africa with the express approval of the Roman Senate. It was essentially made a vassal kingdom in all but name. The Third Punic War was the nail in the coffin for the Carthaginian Empire. Carthage itself was sacked and burned to the ground, and the remaining territory of the empire was put under Roman control. Many cities were completely destroyed. However, some Punic areas were allowed to continue to use their language and practice their own religion. North Africa after this point would go on to become an agricultural center for the growing Roman state, and would be an extremely important province for centuries to come. Pompey the Great, born Gnaeus Pompeius, was an important Roman general and statesman that served during the time of Caesar. Pompey was born to a noble family in the region of Picenum in central Italy. His father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, had been the first member of the family to attain senatorial rank in Rome, and had laid the foundations that would propel Pompey to his eventual political career. Pompey began his career by serving with his father in the Social War in 91 BCE. Pompey would later serve in the Civil War led by Sulla. Pompey supported Sulla, and so he reaped the rewards when Sulla eventually managed to win the war. Pompey would ascend to his first consulship in 70 BCE. His consulship was generally uneventful. Pompey would then prosecute a war against the pirates of the Mediterranean just a few years later, in 67 BCE. In this war, Pompey would succeed in destroying every major pirate cell in the Mediterranean, and it was said that because of this war, organized pirates would not trouble the sea for centuries afterwards. Immediately following this campaign, Pompey was put in charge of the Roman forces in the Third Mithridatic War. Pompey would quickly win the war, and Rome would annex Syria, the rest of Asia Minor, portions of the Caucasus Mountains, and make two new vassal kingdoms in the form of the Kingdom of Armenia and the Bosporan Kingdom. At this point, Pompey was likely the most famous man in the Republic, and so served as a potential kingmaker back in Rome. This would come to fruition with the creation of the first triumvirate. The trio of Pompey, Marcus Crassus, and Caesar would essentially rule the Republic for the next few years, with the only opposition being Cicero and a few other senators. Eventually, though, this agreement would break down, and a civil war would commence, with Pompey on one side and Caesar on the other. We of course know how this would end. Caesar would win, and be on his way towards single-man rule of the Republic. However, it's truly fascinating to think what might have happened if Pompey had been able to overcome Caesar. Would Pompey be the cultural figure that Caesar became? Would the Republic have continued on for centuries to come? Or would Pompey and his sons have seized power and became emperors themselves? We will never know. But Pompey deserves his spot in Roman history as one of the last defenders of the Republic. The 5 good, or great, emperors refer to, well, 5 emperors of Rome, namely Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These men collectively reigned from 96 to 180 AD, a golden era for the Roman Empire. These men were not hereditary rulers, and were instead chosen for their good qualities. These men began the process of fortifying the Roman borders, as well as completing the final stages of expansion in Britain, Dacia, Mesopotamia, and Arabia. These emperors also all undertook extensive programs of Romanization among the newly conquered peoples, as well as creating a uniform system of provincial management. The empire was at its height under these men, and they really benefited from that. The empire was peaceful, prosperous, without serious threats, and mostly free from serious disease. All of this means that this period of rule is seen as a golden age before the more serious collapse that would come in the centuries following. The Gallic sack of 387 BCE is one of the most important events of the early Republic. The sack came about as a result of an invasion by the Senones, a tribe of Gauls that had recently migrated into northern Italy. About a year before the sack, a Roman envoy named Quintus Fabius killed a Gallic ambassador during a meeting in Tusculum, an Etruscan city allied to Rome. The Gauls demanded that the ambassador be handed over to face justice, but the Romans refused, and war broke out. Rome was apparently completely unprepared, and only managed to raise an army filled with untrained and raw recruits. This proved to be disastrous, and the Gauls quickly won at the Battle of the Allia. This opened the way to Rome itself, and the Gauls quickly took advantage of such an opportunity. While I won't get too deep into the details, as a full video on the sack is coming soon, it was disastrous for Rome. It resulted in Rome being burned, and much, if not all, of the records of the history of Rome as a city and as a political force being destroyed. It would take decades for the city to recover, and because of this singular event, our understanding of the history of Rome prior to it are forever stunted. It is one of the greatest what-ifs in Roman history, and if it hadn't happened, our entire understanding of the foundation of Rome, the Roman kingdom, and the early republic could very well be dramatically different. We start with the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard is traditionally associated with the emperors of Rome, but they actually have their origin in the Republican period. The Praetorians were a specialized unit within the Roman army that exclusively served as bodyguards for high-ranking civilians, mostly senators and procurators, and for high-ranking military officials. Their name probably comes from the Praetorium, which was the commander's tent. Since the guard was typically stationed outside of the tent, they were quite literally the Praetorian Guard. The first recorded use of Praetorians was in 275 BCE, when someone in the Scipio family directed a portion of troops under his command to serve as his personal bodyguard. This seemingly stuck in the minds of Roman commanders, and the practice was slowly adopted, especially during sieges when a commander was stationary and thus more vulnerable to attack. We don't quite know when the practice of assigning them to civilians came about, but it was likely only when these important men visited active battle sites that a guard would be assigned. The Praetorians would go on to serve as bodyguards for the last few centuries of the Roman Republic. They even hold the distinction of being the first troops permanently stationed in the Pomerium, the boundary of Rome itself. This was done by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, in 40 BCE, likely as a way of securing his hold over the city. The Praetorians of Octavian would be kept in service upon his ascension as Emperor of Rome, and it's really after this point that the Praetorians evolved into something more than just a unit of bodyguards. After the establishment of the empire, the size of the Praetorian Guard would slowly increase. By the end of Augustus's reign, the Guard consisted of 9 regiments of 1,000 men each. These men were the only men permitted to carry weapons within the Pomerium, something that I'm sure will never be abused. The role of these regiments would slowly transform over time into something of a military police. This unit of the Guard came to be known as the Speculatores, and they would essentially act as a spy service in the emperor's name. They would often disguise themselves as normal Roman citizens, and use that guise to infiltrate public events to monitor and arrest anyone who might be a threat to the emperor's power. I can't go too deep into the activities of the Praetorian Guard during the Middle Empire, but by this point they had grown into one of the most powerful organizations within the entire empire. They quite literally picked the emperor several times throughout the history of the empire, and were probably involved in several assassinations against various emperors. To be honest, there are quite a few times throughout the history of the empire where it seems like the Praetorians are the ones running the show. However, this would put a target on their backs, and eventually Constantine the Great had enough, and forcefully disbanded the Praetorians around 312 AD, after they revolted following an attempt by Severus II and Galerius, the heir and the emperor of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, to disband them. They are truly a fascinating piece of Roman history, and I really wish I could go more in depth here, but one day they will definitely have their own video. Ab Urbi Condita is the masterwork of Livy. This compendium was made up of 142 books, of which 35 survive, either fully or in partial fragments. The book covered Rome's history from Aeneas' arrival in Italy and the founding of the city in 753 BCE, all the way to the reign of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. It's one of, if not the most important source we currently have on the early history of Rome. In fact, for some of the events in Rome's earliest history, Livy is the only source we currently possess. Sadly for us, at least, Livy was writing this history sometime between 27 and 9 BCE, over 700 years since the traditional founding of Rome. Because of this, along with the fact that Livy was not a very good historian, we do have to read Livy with a bit of skepticism. We know for a fact that some of the history in these books are falsified or at least exaggerated by Livy, but we also know that there are pieces of real history in Ab Urbi Condita that we simply cannot find anywhere else. So Ab Urbi Condita is a bit of a mixed bag, but it cannot be denied that the masterwork of Livy is an extremely important starting point in any study of Rome's earliest history. I actually have a video on Livy if you are interested in more detail. I'll link it in the upper right hand corner as well as in the description. The crisis of the 3rd century was one of the Roman Empire's darkest periods. From about 235 to 284, the empire teetered on the brink of complete and utter collapse. The period traditionally starts with the assassination of Severus Alexander, but really the causes for the period of absolute crisis start centuries earlier. The Roman Empire was fairly unique, in that its emperor was not chosen via hereditary or even legal succession. Instead, the emperor was typically chosen based on three things: his own personal ability, the approval of the Senate and the people of Rome, and the approval of the military. The last two were certainly the most important. Because of this, it became a standard practice to use the payment of troops as a way for wealthy Romans to secure military backing to ascend to the emperorship. To add on to this, by this point Rome was simply overextended. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. This meant that Rome was constantly defending itself from raids, wars, and other such attacks from areas like Germany, Iran, Scotland, etc. This was an issue because Rome was a slave economy, even at this point in its history. It relied on plunder gained from conquest to pay its troops, increase infrastructure, and to basically do anything you can think of. As Rome was forced to go more and more on the defensive, this source of income began to dry up. This meant that there simply was less money to go around, and we all know what happens when you don't pay well-trained troops what they believe they deserve. To further exaggerate this issue, the emperor still had to worry about maintaining popular support as well. They secured this typically through infrastructure projects and throwing lavish festivals and games. To continue to pay for these projects, the emperors were forced to divert more funds from the army and other sources, along with seizing assets from various political enemies. This would all come to a head in 235, when Severus Alexander was assassinated. This basically set off a game of musical chairs, as any group with any sort of power, the Senate, Praetorian Guards, and even individual legions, began to nominate their own emperors. Between the start of the crisis in 235 and the end of the crisis in 284, there were at least 26 different men proclaimed emperor. Some of these men, like Maximinus Thrax, actually had a shot at being the real Roman emperor, while others were basically just glorified commanders of individual legions. This political crisis was compounded with a simultaneous environmental crisis. Sea levels rose and droughts affected large portions of Roman lands. Along with this, the outbreak of various diseases, including the Cyprian plague, destroyed Roman agricultural production. And you know what is really bad for internal stability? Famine. This series of events is far too detailed for me to get into right now, but here are some quick highlights. The Emperor Valerian would be captured and later executed in 260. This was the first time a Roman emperor had been captured, and was a deeply humiliating event for Rome and Romans alike. At this point, the empire would begin to split, with the Gallic Empire, consisting of the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Hispania, breaking away in 260 under Postumus, and the Palmyrene Empire, consisting of Syria, Palestine, and portions of Egypt, splitting off in 267 under Queen Zenobia, though officially she was the regent for her son, Babatholus. Greece and Macedonia would be invaded by the Gauls in 268, and all across the Roman world, the borders would be plagued by invasions and raids by various tribes. Cities, especially in the western half of the empire, were completely ruined, and Rome's economy was destroyed. The crisis would really only start to come to an end with the coming of one of Rome's greatest emperors, Aurelian. Aurelian would reunite the empire militarily, but would sadly be assassinated by his own men in 275, which kind of threw the empire back into chaos. Diocletian would come to power in 284 and implement reforms which essentially split the empire into two separate entities known as the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy consisted of 4 men, 2 senior emperors known as the Augusti or Augustus, and 2 junior emperors known as the Caesares or Caesars. This essentially gave 2 halves of the empire to different men to rule over them. This allowed the 2 halves to focus inward and stabilize the empire for a time. However, another series of civil wars would break out in 306, but that's a story for another time. The crisis of the 3rd century may have been the most transformative event in the history of the empire. It ranks up there with Augustus's rise to power and the overthrow of the monarchy in terms of impact on Roman history. Even today, many historians view it as the transition between classical antiquity and late antiquity, the 2 historical periods. This crisis completely changed the way Rome was governed, how its economy worked, the power of the legions, the political power of the Senate, and really I can go on and on. These events changed every aspect of the Roman Empire. I will leave a link to some resources that go much more in depth than I can in this video, but I really can't overstate the importance of this period in Roman history. One day, I will cover it more in depth, but until that day, check out those resources if you wish to learn more. The great Scipio Africanus. quite possibly my favorite Roman of all time. Scipio, born as Publius Cornelius Scipio in 236 BCE, was one of Rome's greatest military commanders, and quite possibly one of history's greatest military commanders. Scipio began his military service in 218 BCE, at the outbreak of the Second Punic War. His father, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, was one of the consuls that year, and was sent to stop Hannibal's march in northern Italy. Of course, the Roman army was mostly unsuccessful, and Hannibal rampaged through Italy. Scipio was at the disastrous Battle of Cannae, and it's said that it was him who rallied the survivors at Canusium. There is a story here that is likely made up by Livy, as it doesn't appear in any other source on the Second Punic War, but I love it, so I'm going to tell it anyway. A group of young nobles were discussing a plan to abandon the war after Cannae, and apparently go overseas to serve as mercenaries. Scipio got wind of this, and he stormed into their tent, where he drew his sword and forced everyone in attendance to swear to Jupiter and the Capitoline that they would never abandon Rome. The story really captures Scipio's commitment to Rome. Scipio would eventually be sent to Hispania to continue the war against Carthage. After a rough defeat of Roman forces in 211, Scipio would be elected as commander of the remaining troops. This was probably not really how it happened. This was probably a later invention used to justify giving Scipio, a man who never held the consulship nor even a praetorship, control of a Roman army. This was a first in Roman history, but it might have been one of the best decisions ever made. Scipio instantly took to the field. I can't go into much detail. If you want more details, then check out my series on Scipio, but he swept across Spain like a plague, and by 206 Hispania was almost entirely Roman. Carthage had been kicked out, and Scipio returned to Rome to stand for the consulship. He was elected unanimously and assumed his consulship in 205, despite the fact he was only 31, technically too young to be consul. Scipio demanded permission to invade Africa itself. At first, the Senate refused, but when Scipio threatened to take the issue to the people of Rome, who adored him, the Senate bowed to his demands. He was given the province of Sicily, and told he could basically do whatever he wanted, but that he was being given no additional soldiers. Scipio, though, didn't care, and just recruited from the local population. After a few years, he had trained his army into a well-oiled machine, and he sailed for Africa proper. As much as I want to regale you with the tales of Scipio's great victory in Africa, you're going to have to check out my separate series on him for details, but Scipio's campaign in Africa went extremely well. He forced Carthage to recall Hannibal and his son Mago from Italy after Scipio destroyed them at the Battle of the Great Plains in 203 BCE, and then he went face to face with Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, where Scipio was victorious. With this final battle, Rome, or really Scipio, triumphed over Carthage. Carthage was essentially made a Roman client state. It needed Roman approval for any war, its navy was capped at 10 triremes, and Carthage was forced to return all captured goods and persons, along with paying war reparations of about 10,000 talents. Remember that at this point in his life, Scipio was still only in his early 30s. He received a triumph and was given the agnomen Africanus, meaning the African. He was such a celebrated figure that he would eventually come to be seen as the son of Jupiter, a great honor for any Roman. His later life was much less interesting. He served as censor in 199, and again as consul in 194. He fought a few more wars, none nearly as great as the Second Punic War, against the Boii and the Ligurians in northern Italy, as well as against Antiochus, the ruler of the Seleucid Empire in Greece. Scipio would die sometime around 185 BCE at his country estate in Laternium. I will leave off our examination with the story, that while probably not real is nonetheless indicative of how well thought of Scipio was as a military commander. It's said that Scipio encountered Hannibal during a feast later in life, and Scipio asked Hannibal who he thought were the greatest generals in history. Hannibal stated, "I would give first place to Alexander. With a small force, he defeated armies whose numbers were beyond reckoning. He overran the remotest areas, as far away as India, places where most men would not even dream of visiting." Scipio then said, "And who would be second in your estimation?" Hannibal said, "I would give second place to Pyrrhus of Epirus. He was the first to master the art of military encampment, and no other general showed such exquisite judgment in choosing his battleground and disposing his troops. He was also skilled at conciliating people, to such a degree that the natives of Italy preferred his rule to that of Rome." Scipio then asked, "And who would be third?" Hannibal responded, "Myself, of course." And finally, Scipio asked, "But what would you have said if you had defeated me at Zama?" And Hannibal said, "Then I would have placed myself not only before Alexander and Pyrrhus, but before all other commanders." Again, this is probably a fake story made up years after the two men had died, but it does capture just how well thought of Scipio's genius was. Scipio Africanus was one of Rome's greatest men, and without him, Rome may never have made it past the great Carthaginian menace. Now that I'm making this video, I'm not really sure why this is so low on the list, but next up we have Romulus and Remus. These two twin brothers are the mythical founders of Rome. The two men were Latin men, born in Alba Longa. Their mother was Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin and daughter of the former king of Alba Longa, Numitor. It's said the boy's father was the Roman god of war, Mars. This is a fairly common theme in Roman history. Many of Rome's most important figures are said to be the sons of gods, and Mars is probably the most common. The twins were left on the banks of the Tiber by Aemilius, the man who overthrew Numitor. They were found there by a she-wolf who raised the boys for a time. Eventually they were adopted by Fastulius, a shepherd. The two would go on to establish separate cities on the 7 hills of Rome. Romulus chose the Palatine, while Remus chose the Aventine. The two disagreed on which city should be the primary city, and during this disagreement, Remus was killed by his brother. That, of course, won the argument for Romulus, and Rome got its name. This story is almost certainly false. We don't really know the true story of Rome's founding, but it's much more likely, and supported by archaeological evidence, that the city developed out of much earlier settlements. We know the hills of the city were inhabited by at least 1000 BCE, centuries before the traditional founding date of 753. There could have been a man named Romulus, and he may very well have had a brother named Remus. The truth is that we will likely never know. The conflict of the orders refers to a centuries-long struggle between the patricians and the plebeians for political, economic, and social rights and privileges. The conflict started during the early ages of the Republic, around 494 BCE. At this point in Roman history, the patricians held all of the power in the state. They were the only people allowed to hold political office, and they held the vast majority of Rome's wealth. The issue was that the patricians, a group of a few hundred families descended from families specially chosen by Romulus and other Roman kings to serve in the Senate, made up a very small percentage of Rome's population. A percentage that was only growing smaller as the Roman state continued to expand and grow. Because of this fact, it fell to the plebeians, Rome's much larger but poorer social class, to serve in Rome's military. The problem was that when these men were forced to serve, they had to leave their farms and fields unattended. This caused them to lose all of their income, and many were forced to ask for predatory loans from the much wealthier patrician class just to survive. These loans opened the plebeians up to a vicious cycle of abuse, and many were made essentially slaves. This boiled over in 494, with the first secession of the plebs. I don't have time to go fully in depth here, but I have made a video on this, so if you want a more in-depth story, definitely check that out. But essentially, the plebeians came together and quite literally left the city en masse. They walked together to the Mons Secure, or Sacred Mount, and essentially set up a massive camp there. A series of negotiations followed that gave the plebeians their own assembly and the ability to elect a new plebeian tribune, an office designed to protect plebeian interests in the Roman government. There would be 4 more secessions over the course of the conflict, along with numerous other events that I simply don't have time to get into. But by 287 or so, the playing field had leveled drastically. This doesn't mean that the poor plebeians were suddenly catapulted into positions of power, or even that their quality of life improved. Instead, the ultimate consequences of the conflict of the orders was that money, not ancestry, became the ultimate source of power in Rome. This baked-in advantage for wealthier Romans would become the status quo for essentially the rest of Roman history, and reflected a new societal organization that was much harder to challenge than the old legal system that supported the patrician dominance of the early republic. The Sibylline books were a collection of oracle utterances sold to Rome's last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. These collections were said to come from the Apollonian oracle at Cumae. These were originally a collection of 9 or so books that were offered to Rome's king at some insane price. He refused to buy them, and then the person offering the books, likely the oracle herself, then burned 3 books in front of him, and again offered the remaining 6 books for the same price. Lucius again refused to buy them. The oracle then burned 3 more books, and offered the last 3 books for the same price. This time, Lucius consulted Rome's priest, who took the auspices, and urged the king to purchase the remaining books. Lucius did so, and the books would be stored in a vault underneath the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. These books would be guarded around the clock, by at least at first 2 patricians. Over time, this group would expand to around 10 to 15 individuals, normally ex-consuls or ex-praetors. The Senate could command this group to open the books. The group would then search the books in hopes of discovering what Rome needed to do to avoid or get out of various calamities. Typically, the answers would be some sort of religious observance or sacrifice. We don't know for sure how many times the books were consulted, but it does seem to be fairly regular. On screen are the recorded instances we know about. You will see that most of these were particularly bad instances of plague, wars that had gone bad, or even just assumptions made from sayings or prophecies contained in the book. My favorite is Suetonius telling us that it was a Sibylline prediction of a king triumphing over Parthia that inspired rumors of Caesar aspiring to be a king. These rumors would ironically lead to the establishment of the empire by Augustus following Caesar's assassination and the subsequent political fallout. You really gotta love vague prophecies. The books are said to have been destroyed sometime around 405 AD by Stilicho, as they were being used to attack his government. But long before that, the originals were likely destroyed in a massive fire in 83 BCE, and were probably replaced by a collection of various utterances collected from across the growing republic. Sadly, we no longer have any collection of the books, and their contents have been lost to history. Aurelian, born Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, was an emperor of Rome during the crisis of the 3rd century. He was not born to any great family, nor was he even born in Italy. Instead, he was probably from somewhere in the Balkans. Some say Macedonia, some say Dacia, it's hard to tell for sure. He was almost certainly Illyrian though. He enlisted in Rome's legion at a young age, somewhere around 20. I can't go too deep into his life, this video is already going to be long enough, but Aurelian was a military genius, and rose through the ranks of the legion very quickly. At this point in Roman history, individual legions were basically recognizing a new emperor every few months, and Aurelian's legion proclaimed him emperor after Claudius Gothicus, the earlier emperor of the legion, died. Aurelian would go on to wage several wars right in a row, with the aim of reuniting the empire. He would achieve this by 272 and was granted the title Restorator Orbis, or Restorer of the World. One of the best titles any emperor has ever received, in my opinion. Aurelian would sadly be assassinated on his way to wage war in Persia by his own Praetorian guards in around 275. Aurelian really represents the start of the end of the crisis. He not only reunited the empire, but he also began a series of reforms that pushed the empire towards a more stable future. These included a reorganization of the distribution of food, new coinage reform, and a campaign to lower inflation. Aurelian only ruled for 5 or so years, and so sadly has missed a lot of the time in the study of the empire's history. But it was his militaristic successes that allowed the empire to become one again, and he put the empire back on the path to glory and prosperity. We start with a question that I think a lot of people ask, but quite simply there isn't a clear answer to, and that is, who is the successor to Rome? This question has been asked thousands of times, and I know everyone has their own answer. Let me lay some groundwork before I list some of the most common answers and the reasoning behind them. First of all, we have to define what exactly Rome is. Roman history is typically split into 4 or so portions. We have the Roman Kingdom from around 753 to 509 BCE. Then we have the Roman Republic from 509 to 31 BCE. Then we have the United Roman Empire from 31 BCE to around 286 AD. And finally, we have the period of the split Roman Empire, from 286 to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. Those years are all rough estimates. Some sources will put the beginning and the end of various periods at different points, but this is roughly the agreed upon start and end dates of the various periods of Roman history. It's at this point that we have to start asking, who is the successor to Rome? Well, the obvious and probably objectively correct answer at this point in history is the Eastern Roman Empire. Today, we call it the Byzantine Empire, But during its history, the empire viewed itself as the Roman Empire. And really it was, just with a Greek spin. Remember, this empire was centered in Constantinople and Greece, and so Greek language, culture, and so on became much more influential as the Byzantine Empire aged. As the Byzantines controlled the east and prospered, the west became a bit of a mess. The Ostrogoths took over the city of Rome, along with Italy and portions of Illyricum following the downfall of Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor. But the main successor we need to look at in the west would be the HRE, or the Holy Roman Empire. The HRE gets a bit of a bad rap nowadays, mostly due to the famous Voltaire quote, "The Holy Roman Empire was in no way holy, nor Roman, nor an empire." And to be fair, at Voltaire's time this was certainly true, and it was debatably true for all of the HRE's history. However, the first emperor of the HRE, the great Charlemagne, was crowned as Emperor of all Romans. This was mostly an act of securing prestige and legitimacy for the Pope and Charlemagne as the new rulers of Western Europe and Catholicism as the dominant and legitimate form of Christianity. Personally, I would argue this is really the weakest claim to the successor of Rome. Firstly, there already was an emperor of the Romans, I really mean empress. Her name was Irene, and she was the regent for her son, Constantine VI. This was even part of the reason the Pope crowned Charlemagne. The West was simply unwilling to accept Irene. In truth though, even by the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, the HRE was not Roman. It was a Germanic empire through and through, and that's something we'll talk about more later in this iceberg. The line of succession then follows the Byzantine Empire. As I already stated, the Byzantines fell in 1453. So then who succeeded them as inheritors of Rome's legacy? Well, it was the Ottoman Turks. Mehmed II, or Mehmed the Conqueror, claimed the title of Roman Emperor on the basis that he had conquered Constantinople, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, which had been the United Roman Empire. And frankly, this makes a lot of sense when you think about it. By 1453, it had been over a millennia since Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire. Constantinople had become the capital of the Roman Empire, and Mehmed had just conquered it. In fact, Mehmed was extremely interested in actually capturing the rest of what had been the Roman Empire. He even mounted an invasion of Italy, capturing the town of Otranto. If Mehmed hadn't died, there's a decent chance that Christendom would have had to unite in another crusade to push the Ottomans out of Italy. Mehmed's successors would never quite have the same drive as him. Instead, they wanted to conquer Vienna, the capital of the Archduchy of Austria and seat of the von Habsburgs, the emperor of the HRE. The thinking being that if they vanished the other claimants to the title, then the title was theirs and theirs alone. Which, to be fair, does kind of make sense. The Ottomans were extremely serious about their claim, and it became a defining title for the sultans. It was only as the Ottomans began to shift their focus more towards Arabia and the title of Caliph that the claim began to take a back seat in terms of importance. There is one more claimant we should look at, the Russian Empire. This claim centers around the idea of Russia being the inheritors of the Orthodox religion. When Byzantium fell, the Tsardom of Muscovy, which would later become Russia, was the most powerful remaining Orthodox state in the world. Because of this, an idea began to develop that painted its capital, Moscow, as a sort of third Rome. The idea was that Moscow would be the place where the Roman Empire would be reborn from the ashes. To further this claim, Ivan III of Russia married Sophia Paleologos, the niece of Constantine XI, who was the last Byzantine emperor. Through this marriage, Ivan claimed that he inherited the title upon Constantine's death. However, it should really be noted that Roman traditions, even as far back as a united Roman Empire, never recognized any sort of automatic inheritance. In fact, 90% of the time, the conflicts of the empire were over who would inherit, and it was kind of a tradition to argue about it for a while. All in all, the claim here is mostly centered around Russia being the inheritors of the Orthodox religion, and by extension, the Byzantine Empire. So those are the main cases. Personally, I really think that when Constantinople fell, so did the Roman Empire. The inheritance of Rome is not about the title of Emperor of the Romans. Instead, it's about what we find in our culture. The use of Latin, architectural designs, the Western system of law, and all of the other many influences in our modern world are the inheritance of the empire. That being said, all hail Mehmed the Conqueror, Kaiser Irum, the Sultan of two lands and the Khan of two seas, conqueror of Constantinople and the true heir of Rome. I don't think I need to tell you who I think has the best claim. One day, I will get way deeper into this history, as it's actually pretty interesting, but until then. This does flow pretty well into our next question. Who would be the Roman Emperor today? Well, if we follow the path of succession in the Ottoman Empire, then we come to this guy, Harun Osman Osmanoglu, and I apologize if that is incorrectly pronounced, the current head of the House of Osman, and the man who would be caliph. But amidst the fall of the Byzantines, one man managed to escape from the downfall, a man named Andreas Palaiologos. He was the son of Thomas Palaiologos, the famous Duke of Morea, who was the brother of Constantine XII, the last Byzantine emperor. Andreas claimed the imperial title following the downfall of his house in 1483. It should be noted here that his father never claimed the title, and just as with Ivan in Russia, his claim is dubious at best. Andreas, though, fell into poverty following the downfall of his family, and desperate for money, sold his titles to Charles VIII, King of France. There was one small condition, however. Charles must, after his conquest of the Ottomans, return the Duchy of Morea to Andreas, the same duchy title his father had held. Charles died before he could act on his new title, and Andreas reclaimed his imperial titles once again. Andreas would go on to die in poverty in Rome in 1502. His will left his titles to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. The two would never act on them, but if we assume Andreas actually legitimately claimed the title, then it passed to them. The realms of the two monarchs would be united upon their death, and the Kingdom of Spain would be formed. If we follow the line of succession, then we come to this man, Felipe VI, the current King of Spain. Although, to be fair, the Kingdom of Spain has changed hands many times, so it's tough to say who would actually have the best claim. If you decide to follow the line of the HRE, then you come to this man, Karl von Habsburg. His ancestor, Francis II, was the last Holy Roman Emperor before Napoleon ruined all that. So if the title of Holy Roman Emperor was to somehow re-emerge, then it would be Karl who would be the main claimant. In the end, it doesn't really matter, but if I had to throw my hat in the ring, I would lean towards Harun Osman as the main successor to the title of Roman Emperor. Frankly, conquest triumphs most things when it comes to Rome, and titles aren't really any different. In the end, of course, it doesn't matter, as Rome being re-established is about as likely as me becoming King of England, so it's really a moot point. Livia, born Livia Drusilla, was the wife of the Roman Emperor Augustus, and is painted as the source of damn near everything bad that ever happened to Augustus, his family, or his empire. Well, that might be going a bit too far, but historians of the time, such as Tacitus and Suetonius, loved to paint Livy as the scheming mastermind behind Augustus, who, among other things, was responsible for the deaths of Augustus's nephew Marcellus, and even the deaths of Agrippa Postumus, the adopted son of Augustus. This was all done so that Tiberius would gain the throne. Tiberius was apparently easily influenced by Livia, and she did all this as a way to gain influence, blah 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 blah. Livia was certainly influential. I mean, she was the wife of the emperor after all. Augustus even called her his chief confidant, and the two apparently discussed the situation of the empire and what to do pretty often. But I seriously doubt she was this evil woman who was only out for power, as she is painted as in many of the histories of the period. I mean, seriously, basically anyone in the extended Julio-Claudian dynasty dies, and somehow Livia had a hand in it. One day, I will make a video examining this history more in depth, but until that day, all I have to say is that Livia was probably mostly innocent. Sulla was one of the most important Romans in history, and he's someone who gets overshadowed by men like Caesar, who was just about 3 decades younger than Sulla himself. Sulla got his start in basically the same way every important Roman did, through his military experience. He fought in Africa, Germania, Anatolia, and even in Italy itself. He would go on to serve as consul in 88 BCE. It was during this time that he would march on Rome in protest of laws made by his enemy Gaius Marius. I can't get too deep into it, as frankly this video would be hours long if I did, but it eventually spiraled into what was Rome's first large-scale civil war, a war Sulla would win. Assuming the mantle of dictator, Sulla proceeded to enact swift and vicious revenge, along with fixing what he saw as flaws in the Republic. He likely ordered the death of over 9,000 people, and even ordered Caesar to be put to death, but Caesar was able to escape with the help of his relatives. Sulla would go on to basically completely rewrite the Roman code of law and conduct in his own image. He would expand the Senate, create a new jury to hold senators to the letter of the law, take away much of the power of the plebeian tribunes, along with many other changes. However, sadly for him, much of his changes would be overturned by 2 of his lieutenants and successors, the famous Pompey and Crassus. Sulla's legacy is one of ruthlessness and bloodshed, and frankly it can even be argued that it was Sulla who laid the groundwork for the Republic to fall. Constantine the Great was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, and his rule represented the beginning of the shift of Rome from a polytheistic state to a Christian monotheistic state. We aren't quite sure when Constantine was born, but we know it was after 280 AD in Naxos, modern-day Niš in Serbia. He was the son of a very successful military officer, Clavius Valerius Constantius. His father would eventually be raised to the rank of Caesar, or junior emperor, of the Western Roman Empire. Constantine was left in the east and raised in the court of Diocletian, the senior emperor of the east. He was something of a hostage, as none of the emperors, junior or senior, quite trusted the others. This didn't stop Constantine from firstly attaining the highest levels of education available, and secondly enrolling in the Roman army. He fought across the eastern half of the empire, and was seemingly fairly good at war, being promoted to tribune during his service. In 305, both Diocletian and Maximian, the emperor of the west, would step down. Galerius would succeed Diocletian, while Constantius, Constantine's father, would succeed Maximian. It was believed by many at the time that Constantine and Maxentius, Maximian's son, would both be chosen to be junior emperors. Instead, both were skipped over and replaced by Flavius Valerius Severus in the west and Galerius Valerius Maximinus in the east. Constantine was now in more danger than ever, and both his father and himself knew it. Luckily for Constantine, his father still held quite a bit of power. Constantius requested his son join him on his campaigns in Britain. In some stories, Galerius simply agreed with no strings attached. In others, it was only after Galerius got massively drunk that he gave permission. It's frankly hard to say what the truth is, but in any case, Constantine joined his father in Britain. It was during this campaign that Constantius fell ill and eventually died. Before his death, he proclaimed his full support for raising Constantine to the rank of Augustus, senior emperor. The troops loyal to Constantius quickly pledged their loyalty to Constantine, and the armies and provinces of Gaul and Britain followed shortly after. Hispania notably rejected this appointment. Constantine then sent notice of his father's death along with notice of his ascension to Galerius in the east. Galerius was infuriated, and at first seemed to be leaning towards declaring war on Constantine. But he was talked down, and the two developed a sort of compromise. Constantine would be granted the rank of Caesar, while Flavius Valerius Severus would become Augustus. Constantine, probably knowing he could not win a civil war, accepted, and Galerius personally sent him the traditional purple robes of the emperor. Constantine was granted the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Hispania. Kind of funny when you consider they were about to rebel against him just a little bit ago, but whatever. During this period, he fought back the Picts in Britain and the Franks in Gaul. There is a great story there whereby the two kings of the Franks, Assaric and Merogius, were captured and fed to beasts inside of Trier's amphitheater, but that's a story for another time. Trier seemed to be Constantine's favored city, and a great expansion of the city took place under his reign. This was also the time where we see his image as a Christian sympathizer began to develop. He outlawed persecutions of Christians within his realm, and ordered most of the property and other goods seized from them in centuries past returned. Back in Rome, trouble was brewing. Maxentius, the son of Maximian, who had been skipped over, had been plotting. He took the appointment of Constantine as Caesar as a grave insult, and it seemed to accelerate his plans. He rebelled, claiming the title of emperor. Galerius told Flavius Valerius Severus to deal with the rebellion. Sadly for Severus, though, the troops used by him were the same troops that Maximian had been in charge of, and they almost instantly defected to Maxentius' side. Severus was imprisoned, and Maximian, who was in retirement at this point in the Italian countryside, journeyed to Trier to speak to Constantine. Maximian offered Constantine the hand of his daughter in marriage, along with the promise of being raised to the rank of Augustus in exchange for his support of Maxentius' rebellion. Constantine accepted, but instead of charging in headfirst into the conflict, he remained in Gaul and then Britain, along with the vast majority of his troops. In the meantime, Maximian apparently had a falling out with his son, and after failing to usurp the title of emperor, returned to Constantine. A council then occurred in 308, where Galerius, Diocletian, and Maximian basically argued over who should be Augustus and who should be Caesars. They decided that Valerius Licinius Licinius would become Augustus of the West, with Constantine serving as his Caesar. This basically did nothing, as Constantine refused to accept the demotion, Maxentius was still mad and had an army now, and Maximian was now mad because he had apparently been in the running to be Augustus once again in the West. Yeah, the situation was a bit complicated. In 310, Maximian led his own rebellion against Constantine, Sadly for him though, the army he had mostly remained loyal to Constantine, and he was forced to flee. Eventually, Constantine caught up to him. He pardoned the man, but apparently strongly encouraged him to, well, I can't actually say this word on YouTube, but let's just say Maximian ended up dead. Maxentius used this opportunity to paint himself as a devoted son looking to avenge his father, and gained quite a bit of public sympathy. In the meantime, over in the east, Emperor Galerius died in 311, and this was when the whole system basically fell apart. Maxentius seized Anatolia and began to fortify his position against Constantine. Sadly for Maxentius though, his popularity was beginning to wane, and rebellions and riots began to pop up all over the place, including in Roman Carthage. It was at this time that Constantine crossed the Alps and began his war against Maxentius. I won't get too deep into this, as this episode is already long enough, but Constantine managed to win despite being numerically outnumbered. After this, Constantine slowly asserted himself as the most powerful man in the empire. He was able to push for the Edict of Milan to be issued in 313, which ended Christian persecution in the entire empire. After a series of wars and political intrigue, Constantine became the sole emperor in 326, and he was now the undisputed ruler of Rome. It was around this time that Constantine began his plans to build a new capital in the east, Constantinople. The rest of his reign was mostly focused on the frankly more boring aspects of empire, monetary reforms, and so on. Constantine would die in 337. It's said he was baptized just before he died, but some sources dispute this. Constantine would be succeeded by his three sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. Not very creative in the whole naming convention. He likely intended for something similar to the old system of the Tetrarchy to make a return, something that didn't quite happen, but that's a story for another time. Constantine was the first emperor to embrace, or at least tolerate, Christianity, and it was his reign that started the empire on the path towards full conversion to the new religion. His legacy would live on for millennia afterwards, not only for his stance towards Christianity, but also in his new city, Constantinople. The Senate in the empire refers to the power dynamic between the Senate and the empire during Rome's later years. The Senate was in a bit of an odd place when Augustus came into his power as emperor. It was an arguably democratic body within what was essentially a totalitarian dictatorship where power was concentrated in the hands of one man, the emperor. Because of this, the Senate was in a sort of limbo state. It was too ingrained into Roman society to simply get rid of, but it also simply didn't hold any sort of real power. Instead, it became essentially a rubber stamp for the emperors. If the Senate tried to stop or go against the emperor, they would either be ignored or simply dissolved, with new senators replacing them. And yet, many emperors, especially the earlier ones, still went out of their way to ensure their influence over the body was at least somewhat hidden. So why was that? Well, I think it has to do a lot with Rome's extreme aversion to anything even approaching a king. The Roman people would be upset if an individual was seen as obviously controlling a body such as the Senate. That was what those old kings did, and they were bad after all. So the emperor had to walk a bit of a tightrope. They couldn't and wouldn't allow the Senate to have any actual power over themselves or the state, but they had to be discreet enough in their challenges to the Senate to ensure that it looked like they were working with the body to govern the empire. Because of this, the Senate remained the entity that elected emperors. It was even the Senate that technically gave the emperor his imperium. It was really only in the late imperial period, post about 180 AD, that the Senate really began to be obviously relegated, and by 300 AD, it was made clear that the emperor answered to no one, not even the Senate. But for the early Roman emperors, it was a tight line they walked, and if one of them had been just a little more open in their, now blindingly obvious, power plays over the Senate, it may very well have spelled doom for the Roman Empire, and we may have seen a resurgence of the Republic. We start with the HRE. The HRE, or Holy Roman Empire, was essentially Western Europe's replacement for the Western Roman Empire. Or at least that's what they billed it as, so to speak. The empire was created in 800, when Pope Leo III crowned the great Charlemagne as Emperor of all Romans. This was more than 300 years on since the fall of the Western Empire, and was done during a time where Byzantium in the east was still thriving. To begin with, the empire was simply referred to as the Roman Empire. It wouldn't add the holy part until the reign of Frederick Barbarossa in 1157. At first, the empire was basically just a copy of Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire. but over the course of its multiple centuries of existence, the empire would include lands from all across Western Europe, from Brittany in the west, to Holstein in the north, to Naples in the south, and to Krakow in the east. Not all at the same time, mind you. The HRE is a very odd political entity, and it really deserves its own video to explain all the intricacies of its political situation, but here's a quick rundown. The first thing to know is that the empire was very decentralized for most of its history. Basically, from the death of Charlemagne, the power of the Holy Roman Emperor was subject to how much lip service the various kingdoms, duchies, and other political entities in the quote-unquote empire were willing to give to the emperor. The empire would be centered in Germany following Charlemagne's death, and it became a sort of elective monarchy. Eventually, the HRE came to have hundreds of distinct political entities in its borders. Some were quite powerful, such as the Kingdom of Bohemia or the Archduchy of Austria. Others, such as the imperial city of Ulm or the imperial city of Überlingen, were literally just independent cities that basically held no political power. The emperors were elected by, typically, 7 prince-electors. These prince-electors were individual states who, either through personal power or through their relationship with the Pope, were granted the right to choose who should be emperor. At some points in history, this was an actual election, where 2 or more rulers genuinely competed for votes with the electors. At other points in history, this was more of a rubber stamp process, where everyone really knew who was going to be elected before the election even happened. As any good EU4 player knows, the original electors were the Archbishopric of Mainz, the Archbishopric of Cologne, the Archbishopric of Trier, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the County Palatinate of the Rhine, later the Duchy of Bavaria before the Palatinate would come back in 1648, the Duchy of Saxe-Wittenberg, and the Margravate of Brandenburg. There were a few other states that eventually gained the title of Prince-Elector. Most were either added or gained the title through succession. The amount of power an emperor held depended on a lot of factors. Some, such as Frederick Barbarossa, were able to exert quite a lot of influence and power through their own prestige, land, and personal power, while others only really held power over their personal lands and were essentially figureheads for the empire. The empire would come to an end in 1806, when Napoleon replaced it with the Confederation of the Rhine. By this point, the empire was without a doubt fully German, and it had essentially been operating as a German empire for the past few centuries. I know that was a very basic overview, but I can't get super deep into the HRE in this one video. One day I probably will do a whole HRE series where I really dig into its history, but until then, I will leave a few recommended readings for the history of the HRE in the description. Sextus Tarquinius was one of the sons of Rome's last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. It's said that it was his rape of Lucretia, the daughter of Spurius Lucretius, a leading man of Rome, that kick-started the overthrow of the Roman kings. After the horrific crime, Lucretia committed suicide, after telling her father and husband. Following this, a sort of committee was formed, led by some of Rome's leading men and relatives of the king, including Lucius Junius Brutius, Lucius Tarquinius Collentanus, Lucretia's husband, and Spurius Lucretius Tricipitanus. These men began to gather support among Rome's nobility, and while the king was away campaigning in Ardea, the men led a coup. The gates were shut upon the king's return to Rome, and the coup leaders even convinced the army at Ardea to join them. Brutus and Collentanus became the first consuls, and the history of the Republic goes on from there. Before we get into the theory, let's get something straight. This event was probably totally legendary. We know, for instance, that the story bears striking resemblance to Greek myths, and when you add the fact that sexual violence against innocent women is an extremely common trope to use against tyrannical kings in ancient history, you start to see a picture develop that paints these events as simply later creations to make the coming of the Republic a much more grand and moral affair. The truth is that we will never be sure if these events actually happened or not, but it's likely they didn't. The main part of this theory is that if these events did happen as Livy and other historians of the period tell us, then Sextus may have been framed for the event, and simply used as the scapegoat to instigate an aristocratic coup. There is some evidence for this, or at least for the coup. We know from the archaeological record that around 500 BCE, there is evidence of some sort of mass-scale destruction around the Comitium, the original public meeting place in Rome. This was the area where basically all political and judicial activity happened within the city. It would make sense then that some sort of destruction would happen here during a coup, either due to fighting or simply destroying the old symbols of the previous rulers. Further, a building that we are pretty sure was originally a royal home was destroyed around this time at the base of the Capitoline. giving further evidence towards some sort of coup or large-scale dissatisfaction towards the monarchy. It would be pretty easy to understand why the plotters would look for something as morally wrong as the crimes of Sextus to kickstart their own plans. It's so much easier to convince the aristocrats, the people, and the army to rebel against a king if that king is seen as endorsing or at least staying silent towards such a horrid crime. In the end, we will never know. We know that much of early Roman history is likely made up, or at least based on questionable sourcing at best. Even the Romans themselves knew this, with Cicero describing the early Roman history as, quote, a forgery. So, is it possible that Sextus was framed as a catalyst to push for a coup? Sure. Is it possible that none of this ever happened and it was simply a later invention? Sure. We will likely never know. Heraclius was the Byzantine emperor from 610 to 641. He was born to Heraclius the Elder in around 575. His father was the exarch, basically governor, of Africa, a realm that stretched from the edge of Egypt all the way to Hispania. In 608, Heraclius the Elder would lead a rebellion against Phocas, an extremely unpopular emperor who himself had rebelled against the Emperor Maurice in 602. The younger Heraclius captured Sicily and Cyprus before marching on the capital city, Constantinople. Luckily for Heraclius, the aristocrats along with the personal guard of the emperor defected to him, and basically opened the gates for him and his army. Phocas was beheaded, and Heraclius the Younger was crowned as emperor in 610. Heraclius is mainly known for his successes on the battlefield. Heraclius was able to defeat the Sassanids, and even managed to claim the ancient Persian title King of Kings. This was after the Sassanids had captured Egypt, Mesopotamia, most of Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine. The situation had been so dire that Heraclius had seriously considered abandoning Constantinople and retreating to Carthage. And there was even a point in 615 where some sources say that Heraclius very nearly ordered the surrender of the empire to the Sassanids, but apparently the Sassanids refused the offer. This is all to say that his campaign against the Sassanids was incredible, and for many at the time was likely viewed as a genuine miracle. Heraclius was gearing up to take the fight to the newly united Arab tribes in 641, when he died of some sort of illness. His legacy was one of success, however. He brought the empire back from the brink, and if he hadn't been able to defeat the Persians, then the empire would have likely fallen some 800 years before 1453. Roman propaganda mostly refers to the Augustan period, whereby, for possibly the first time in Rome's history, a true, well-funded, and well-organized program of propaganda was employed by the government. This was all with the goal to strengthen Augustus' grip on power. This isn't to say that Rome never had propaganda before Augustus, because they certainly did. Just look at Cato's famous quote, "Carthage must be destroyed," and Caesar's books on his conquest of Gaul. But it was really with Augustus that propaganda began to be used as a weapon for the state. The centerpiece to that propaganda was the cultural and historical writings of the period. The most commonly cited writing is the Res Gesti Divi Augusti, or the Deeds of the Divine Augustus. Written shortly before his death by the main man himself, this book basically details every good thing that he had ever done for the state, from heroically avenging his adopted father, Caesar, to the buildings he ordered constructed in the city itself. Again, notice the name of this book, The Deeds of the Divine Augustus. It's fairly obvious what Augustus wanted to achieve here, painting himself as a divine, or at least connected to the divine entity. To add on to this, the Aeneid, quite possibly the most famous piece of Roman literature, was written in Augustus's time, and guess whose patronage the author of the Aeneid, Virgil, was under? That's right, Augustus. Augustus also used physical works to further his propaganda. He ordered a widespread building program in the city of Rome, and by the end of his reign, very nearly every structure in the city had something to do with Augustus. This served two purposes. Firstly, it ingrained his name in the populace, and secondly, it demonstrated that the empire was prosperous. Otherwise, how could all these buildings be built? Augustus used this propaganda to paint himself as the greatest man in Rome, and as the guarantor of the Pax Romana, sometimes even called the Pax Augusta. He targeted every aspect of Roman society, from its art and architecture to its very history. The Altar of Victory was a famous altar located in the Roman Senate House. It contained a gold statue of the goddess Victory, who was literally the embodiment of victory. Victory herself represented Rome's right to rule and their triumph over their enemies, most famously the Carthaginians and the Greeks. The altar itself was created by Octavian before he was Augustus in 29 BCE. The statue within was said to come from Greece, where it was a depiction of Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. Rome had captured the statue during the Pyrrhic War in 272 BCE. The statue was made of gilded bronze, winged and dressed in a flowing robe. The goddess stood atop a globe, and a laurel wreath, a symbol of military victory, was held in her right hand. The statue had likely been in the Roman Senate house since its capture, but the altar had been created some 200 years later. The altar became the area where the senators of Rome offered their prayers for the well-being of the empire, and took their oaths of loyalty upon the ascension of a new emperor. The altar remained in the Senate house until 357, when Constantius II had it removed. Julian the Apostate, the last emperor following the traditional religion, had it replaced sometime during his reign, but it was again removed in 382 by Gratian. Various Roman senators petitioned the emperor to replace the altar, not as a religious object, but as a reminder of the history and the greatness of Rome. But each request was denied. Some of our sources say that the statue itself was still present in the Senate house in 403. This leads to a bit of confusion. Some say that the statue itself may have remained in the Senate house while the altar was removed, but others say this was actually a restoration of the altar at this point in history. We just don't know for sure. In any case, by 408, an edict was passed against heathen statues. At this point, the altar and the statue fall out of history, and they are completely lost. It's possible that it was simply melted by the Visigoths when they sacked Rome in 410, or perhaps it was simply stashed away by some pagan sympathizers in the Senate and was forgotten about in some vault somewhere. We will likely never know. The Historia Augusta is a collection of biographies of Roman emperors, heirs, usurpers, and even junior Roman emperors. The collection was based on Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, and was written during the reigns of Diocletian and Constantine the Great. The book itself presents 6 different authors, known as the Scriptores Historiae Augusta, but many historians today say it was likely written by a single person. The books we still have consist of 30 biographies. They start with Hadrian and end with Quirinus and Numerian. Hadrian ruled in 117, while Quirinus ruled in 283, just to give you an idea of the scope of these collections. We have lost portions of the biographies on Philip the Arab, Decius Tribonius Gallus, Aemilian, and most of Valerian's. Further, some argue that the original Historia Augusta also contained biographies of Nerva and Trajan, the 2 emperors before Hadrian. While the collection was originally viewed as widely reliable, today most modern historians doubt much of its work. In many ways, it's actually very similar to Livy's Ab Urbi Condata. Most historians know or strongly guess that much of its information is false, or at least inaccurate, but it's the only Latin work we have for over a century of Roman history, so it cannot be simply discarded. Instead, much like Livy, the Historia Augusta must be read with extreme caution, and should not be blindly believed. For instance, many of the quote-unquote historical records entered into the Historia Augusta, including letters, speeches, and senatorial decrees, are known to be forgeries. We know this either through stylistic grounds, for instance, the way the supposed senatorial decrees were structured, or because the military or administrative titles used in the letters were not recorded anywhere else until centuries after the supposed record in question. Further, the collection cites many historians, letter writers, and other sources that are simply unrecorded anywhere else, a bad sign when dealing with historiography. There are also several errors in birth dates, the locations of various emperors at various points in time, and the terms of office for several important figures. The Historia Augusta is much like Ab Urbi Condata, a bit of a mixed bag. We know that many portions of it are likely very false, but we simply cannot ignore it, as in some cases, it's the only extant source we have. Because of this, we are forced to use the source with extreme caution, and try and pick out the truth from in between the lies. First up, the Aeneid. The Aeneid is an epic poem by Virgil. The poem tells the legendary story of Aeneas and the eventual founding of the city of Rome. The poem is made up of 12 different books. The first 6 start with Aeneas' journey to Italy following the Trojan War, and the last 6 deal with his and his group's wars in Italy. I can't get too deep into the story of the Aeneid, as we would literally be here all day, but here are the quick cliff notes. Book 1 starts off with Aeneas, who is an actual character in the Iliad, who has just fled the downfall of Troy. Aeneas is the subject of a prophecy foretelling that he will journey to Italy, where he will give rise to a, quote, noble and courageous race that will be known to the whole world. Aeneas sets off from Troy, following the Greek coast to Sicily and then eventually Carthage. Book 2 and 3 are mostly a retelling of the story of the Trojan War, which Aeneas is relaying to Dido, the queen of Carthage. It is essentially the story of Troy that we're all familiar with, just with the added bonus of the slain Prince Hector and the goddess Venus, Aeneas' mother, appearing to Aeneas and telling him to flee the city before it can fall. Book 3 finishes with the tales of Aeneas' journey to Carthage. They initially build a city on Crete, but are forced to leave it following a plague. They find a harpy who tells them to continue to Italy. They encounter Andromache, the widow of Hector, and Helenus, one of Priam's sons, and both tell Aeneas of his ultimate destiny, and finally they journey through the land of the Cyclopses. Yeah, real fun times. Book 4 picks up back in Carthage. Queen Dido has fallen in love with Aeneas and attempts to get him to marry her. At first, Aeneas is very receptive to her love, and it seems like the two will marry. However, Aeneas is reminded of his duty by the god Mercury. This leaves Aeneas with no choice, and he and his companions leave in the dead of night. Dido is thrown into grief, and she commits suicide, but declares that her people will forever be set against Aeneas and his people, predicting the Punic Wars. Book 5 details Aeneas' time in Sicily. Here the men participate in a variety of games as well as military parades, two things that would eventually become central to Roman identity. Towards the end of the book, he is told to journey to the underworld to receive a vision of his and his people's future. Book 6 chronicles that journey in the underworld. Here he meets Cerberus and the Shade of Dido, who remains irreconcilable. Finally, he is brought to the fields of Elysium, where he is shown a vision of the destiny of Rome. He sees the greatest men of Rome, men like Romulus, Marcus Camillus, and the Caesars. Book 7 starts with the Trojans settling in Latium. He marries the daughter of a Latin king, Latinaeus. The daughter, whose name was Lavinia, was supposed to marry a king of the Rutuli, Turnus. Turnus, in his anger, declares war upon Aeneas and his men. The war carries over to Book 8, where Aeneas is now seeking help from the various tribes around Latium. He first turns to the Tuscans, who are enemies of Turnus. This journey brings him to the future site of Rome, where he meets King Evander of Arcadia, a region in the Peloponnese. Evander's son even joins Aeneas. Aeneas is given weapons by Vulcan after his mother, Venus, begs Vulcan to arm Aeneas and his men. Book 9 starts with an attack by Turnus on the Trojan camp. He is repelled and forced to jump into the Tiber. Book 10 has Aeneas return to the camp with his new allies, and a battle ensues, which Aeneas wins. Book 11 really only deals with the funeral of Pallas, the son of King Evander. And finally, Book 12 deals with Aeneas' final victory over Turnus. Aeneas and Turnus fight in single combat, and Aeneas finally kills him. And really that's it. After that, Aeneas starts a line of kings that would eventually culminate in Romulus, and then the story of Rome as we know it plays out. Now I'm sure we can realize that a lot of this is obviously not true, like Aeneas' journey into the underworld, the encounter with a king of the Peloponnese at the future site of Rome, and of course the intervention of various gods throughout the story. I haven't seen many claims that those things are true, but what I do see a lot of people claim to be true is the flight of some of Troy's survivors to Rome, or at least to Latium. Frankly, there's no evidence for this. Firstly, we know for a fact that the Aeneid was primarily written, as I discussed in the last episode, as a form of propaganda. Its goal was to increase Roman pride in their state. This would naturally increase social cohesion, which was at an all-time low, what with the constant state of civil war and all that, and that social cohesion would lead to a more stable state, or at least that was the hope. Secondly, we have no evidence of anything like this in either the archaeological record or in Greek writings. Rome and the surrounding area are one of, if not the most excavated sites in the world. The careers of some of the best archaeologists and historians the world has to offer have been dedicated to Rome, and there has never been anything even remotely suggesting a large influx of Greek refugees at any point in Rome's history. We should have found something if it existed, be it letters, other writings, new building techniques, new religious artifacts. I mean, just think about how different the cultures of Latium and the cultures of Troy would have been. It's impossible to have a merging of those cultures without both leaving some sort of imprint on the historical record. Okay, Look, the point is that we have never found any solid evidence of Trojans coming to Italy, despite the fact that the area they were supposed to have colonized being the most studied area in the entire world. But to play devil's advocate just a little bit, is it possible for the Trojans to have made it to Italy? Sure. Is it likely? Well, no. The Aeneid is a legend and a myth. It was written to legitimize Roman rule over the Mediterranean, to give Rome a link to the great history of the Greeks, to emphasize good Roman characteristics, and to bring the Roman populace of the time closer together to hopefully prevent another series of terrible civil wars. It's not history, and frankly, it never will be history. The truth is that Rome developed out of the local Italian population, the Latins, and likely with a little bit of help, or possibly domination, from the Etruscans, a people to their immediate north. It was not a sudden influx of Trojan heroes that pushed Rome to become a great city. It was the result of thousands of years of habitation and the gradual, but steady, crawl towards city-state status. We're doing this a little bit out of order, but it fits pretty well here, so I'm going to go ahead and cover it. The founding of Rome has been a hotly debated topic for a very long time. The Romans themselves claim their city was founded by Romulus. The exact date is a little bit up for debate, but most of the time 753 BCE is generally accepted as the most common. But 800, 750, 720, among others, were also recorded by various Roman authors. Today, with the advantage of archaeology and access to far more historical records than contemporary Romans, we know that Rome, or at least the hills that would make up Rome, had been inhabited for much longer. We know for a fact that Rome was occupied by the middle of the Bronze Age, circa 1700 BCE, and we suspect that it was at least partially inhabited even before that. This evidence mostly comes from pottery shards and a few burial structures. The Capitoline was probably the first to be inhabited, in about 1700 BCE. The Palatine was probably next, around 1350 or so. By 900, we are fairly positive that all the hills of Rome had at least some sort of habitation. Terraces have been discovered on both the Palatine and the Capitoline that indicate the local population were likely Latin farmers, who slowly spread to the other hills in the area. It was around the 8th century BCE that activity in Rome began to really pick up. At this point, the largest settlement was probably on the Palatine, but the Capitoline and the Coronial hills both held a decently sized population as well. It was around this time that the Forum began to develop. Burials in the area were stopped, and portions of it were paved over. We see the first evidence of a wall in about 730 or 720 on the Palatine. It seems that at this point, the city of Rome had developed a true boundary. There were gates and streets, and overall we see an increasing level of centralization, something you would expect with a developing city-state. By 600 BCE, Rome was almost certainly united. The clans that had occupied the hills in earlier centuries were now all intermingling, and the development of the Forum as a central meeting area, along with designated civic structures, points towards a system of government. So we can certainly say that by 600 BCE, Rome had been founded. Is it possible that the city had become what we would call Rome before that? Sure. The truth of the founding of Rome is that it's complicated. It was not a sudden process. It was a long, drawn-out process over multiple centuries. Because of that, you could say that Rome was founded in 1700 BCE with the first evidence of habitation on its hills. Or you could say it wasn't until about 600 BCE, when all the hills seemed to have united into one political entity, that Rome was truly founded. Frankly, we will likely never know for sure when Rome became Rome instead of just a loose collection of villages. But it did happen, and we will likely have to be content with just knowing that. The Legio IX Hispania, or more commonly known as the 9th Spanish Legion, was a legion in the Roman army that has been lost to history. It's become something of a cultural icon, with novels, movies, and endless theories about what may have happened to the legion. But first, I should give you a quick overview of the known history of the legion, as it may help us try to figure out what exactly happened to bring about the disappearance of an entire legion. The legion likely got its start in 90 BCE, during the Social War, but it's most famous for being assigned to Julius Caesar when he became governor of Cisalpine Gaul. When he became governor, he inherited the lead of 4 legions, the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. It seems that the legion was at first ordered to remain in Aquileia, a town on the border of Cisalpine Gaul, to guard against a possible invasion by the Illyrians. but we know the legion served under Caesar during his famous Gallic Wars. The legion continued to support Caesar during his civil wars, and following his victory, the legion was disbanded, and the veterans were settled in Italy, specifically around the city of Picenum. Those veterans would be recalled by Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, during the war with the boat king Sextus Pompeius. The legion would then be sent to Macedonia before fighting with Octavian at the Battle of Actium against Mark Antony. Their nickname, Hispania, would be gained following Octavian's rise to sole ruler of Rome. They would be sent to Hispania, otherwise known as Spain, to campaign against local tribes and to garrison the area. This seems like a good time to mention that tracking individual legions is something that is difficult to do at the best of times. Firstly, before Augustus standardized the legion's numbering system, there were multiple legions who were named with a single number. Because of this, the early actions of legions are sometimes mixed up with other legions that held the same number. We are also missing some of the documents that would tell us where legions were sent during the imperial period, and sometimes legions were simply ordered to move with no real record of the order being recorded. This especially happened when it was the emperor himself who ordered the legion to move. So we are mostly guessing where the legion went following their time in Hispania. It's likely they were ordered to the Rhine, an area that needed far more legions than Spain did at the time. They were probably relocated after the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD and sent to the province of Pannonia, modern-day Western Hungary. At this point, the 9th falls off the radar until 43 AD, when they appear in Britain as a provincial garrison. They likely served during the invasion of the area under Claudius. At this point, the 9th became a leading legion in Britain. They fought against various native tribes, and even fought the famous Iceni under Boudicca. It was during the war with Boudicca that the legion suffered their first serious defeat in Britain. They lost most, if not all, of their foot soldiers attempting to relieve a siege at modern-day Colchester. Only the cavalry managed to escape. This took the legion out of commission for a time, but eventually they were reinforced with men from Germania. We know that the 9th participated in the invasion of Caledonia, or Scotland, in 82 to 83 AD, and that they reconstructed a legionary fortress in York in 108 AD. But after that, they seemed to disappear from the historical record. Modern archaeology has found some evidence of further activity of the legion in the Netherlands. Several tile stamps and some jewelry have all been found containing some sort of inscription mentioning the 9th Spanish Legion. Further, a shrine to Apollo was found near Aachen, in Germany, that was said to be erected by Lucius Latinus Macer, who described himself as the chief centurion and prefect of the camp of the 9th Spanish Legion. So, it seems as though the legion left Britain following their activities at York and journeyed to the Rhine, where they were seemingly based between 104 to about 120. So what happened after that? Well, we know that by 197, the legion seemingly no longer existed. We know this because of a column inscribed with the list of the legions from 197, along with a list provided by Dio Cassius. The two lists are identical, and list the same 33 legions, with no sign of the 9th Spanish Legion, or even anything near it. So we can assume that whatever happened to the legion happened between our archaeological evidence in or around 120 and the compiling of the lists in 197. The traditional theory, before the archaeological findings, was that the legion was wiped out in the north of Britain sometime around 108. This is, of course, seemingly disproven with the archaeological evidence. Those findings indicate that the legion was not only still intact, but seemingly fairly successful, as the officers who had inscriptions at the area in the Netherlands went on to have fairly successful public careers, something that obviously would have been impossible if they had been in charge of or died with an annihilated legion. This has led to the development of two main theories to explain the loss. The first has to do with the Second Jewish Revolt in 132, well within our time frame. We know that in the early stages of the war, Rome suffered heavy casualties. It would make sense then that the legions would be summoned from across the empire to deal with the rebellion. Perhaps the 9th was one of those legions called in. To complicate this though, another legion, the Legio 22 Diotarania, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, or Diotarius' 22nd Legion, is generally agreed upon as suffering such heavy losses during this rebellion that it was either completely destroyed or simply disbanded. If we assume that both were lost during this war, then that would mean it was the worst Roman military disaster since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which lost 3 legions. If that is true, then we would expect there to be some sort of historical record with the event. After all, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was engraved into Roman society. Its impact was so large in the Roman character that it would be remembered for generations, and every Roman historian who was worth their salt recorded the legion numbers of the lost legions, 17, 18, and 19 by the way. The other theory is that during Marcus Aurelius's war in Parthia, from 161 to 166, the legion was ordered to take part. Cassius Dio accounts that a Parthian army surrounded and completely annihilated a Roman legion in Armenia during this war. This defeat was enough to cause the governor of Cappadocia to commit suicide, as the legion was supposed to be under his command. The two legions that were supposed to be attached to Cappadocia at the time were the Thunderbolt 12th Legion and Apollo's 15th Legion. Both of these legions were operational and used in war well beyond the war in Parthia, so it couldn't have been either of those legions that were destroyed. So the theory is that the 9th was transferred to the command of Cappadocia for the duration of the war and was destroyed during that ambush. Again, the issue here is that there is no record of such a transfer, nor have we found anything in the archaeological record. And yet still, other scholars still believe the legion met its ultimate destruction in Britain. This mostly relies on the fact that no record of the legions in the east has ever been found, and that the dating of the archaeological finds could be incorrect. So, in the end, we again have no idea what really happened to the 9th Legion. We know that they were there in 108 and likely in 120, but by 197 they were gone. We likely will never know what exactly happened to them. But personally, I would probably put my stock in the Parthian theory. The archaeological findings in the Netherlands seems to prove that the army left Britain. I don't think the Jewish theory could be accurate, as losing 2 whole legions would have left a serious impact on Roman history and would have been something that would be well attested to. But we will probably never know for sure. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, or as it is less often known, the Varian disaster, is one of Rome's most humiliating defeats. In fact, you could probably say this is the most influential defeat the Romans ever faced, and it marks the transformation of the empire from a successful expanding state to a more introspective state focused on its own survival. Before we can talk about the battle itself, we should first set the scene just a little bit. Rome had been dealing with the various Germanic tribes since Caesar had pushed the Roman border to the Rhine during his famous Gallic Wars. The border proved to be one of the most active in the world, with various incursions by both sides happening basically every year, and most of the time multiple times a year. Our story really starts with a Roman named Verus. Verus was a very successful Roman, despite his family having fallen on hard times when he was born. Verus was a very strong supporter of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. He served alongside him during his campaigns in the east, and even seemed to have gained the attention of Octavian himself. When Agrippa died in 12 BCE, it was Verus, along with the future Emperor Tiberius, who delivered the eulogy. This was a position of supreme honor. Agrippa had been the closest friend of Augustus. The two were essentially brothers, and for Augustus to allow Verus to give his eulogy was a great honor. This boosted his career, and just a year later, he was elected consul, once again alongside the future Emperor Tiberius. For a few years, Verus shifted around the empire, governing various provinces, including Africa, Syria, and Judea. He even put down the Jewish revolt in the area in 4 BCE. While all this was going on, Tiberius had been waging several military campaigns in Germania, with the aim of conquering the region and pacifying the local tribes. By the year 6 AD, all of Germany up to the river Elbe was seemingly occupied, and now Rome needed to exert control over the region. In the year 7, Verus was appointed as the unofficial governor of the region, and was told to ensure it was added to the Roman fold. This appointment really made a lot of sense, as Verus was an experienced military and administrative man. He also had dealt with local rebellions, and so seemingly had some experience in controlling an unruly local population. Verus was given command of 3 legions. These were the 17th, 18th, and 19th. While encamped for the summer at Vetera, modern-day Xanthan, Verus received reports of a large revolt of various Germanic tribes in the west of the province. The man who came with this warning was Arminius, almost certainly not his name by the way too Latin. Arminius was a German noble who had been born to a chieftain allied with Rome. Because of this, he was raised in a manner similar to that of Roman nobility. He learned Latin, was well versed in the classics, and even joined the Roman military. He was educated in all Roman military theory over the course of about 5 years, and even managed to earn Roman citizenship and the equestrian rank. No small feat. However, some of the other German nobles in Varus's retinue didn't quite trust Arminius. We don't know for sure why, but we do know that several nobles warned Varus not to trust him. Varus, though, ignored their advice and marched at once to put down the rebellion. The army marched at daybreak, and all seemed to be going well. Arminius was with the army for the first few days, but at some point he told Varus that he would be leaving with most of his forces to move ahead and finish mustering Rome's German allies. With hindsight, we know this was suspicious, but at the time it really wasn't. Arminius was seemingly committed to the Roman cause, and his status, being the son of a local chieftain, meant that he was the go-between for the Roman army and the local auxiliaries. So, Varus let the man go. Arminius left behind only a few of his men. These men were supposedly guides, but in reality they served as spies. You see, Arminius had already betrayed Varus. There was indeed a rebellion, but it was a rebellion spearheaded by Arminius. On September 8th, in the year 9, the Roman army was marching through a thick forest. This forced the army to do two things. Firstly, they were marching at a snail's pace, and secondly, they were strung out into a long, thin line. In fact, from the head of the army to the tail end of the force, the distance was likely over 10 miles long. Perfect ambush territory. Early in the morning, the Germans struck. This first assault was actually pretty light and was mainly just an attempt to tire the Romans out and pull the few remaining rebellious Germans out of the Roman army. The engagement was brief, but it accomplished its goals. Following this, we are told that a downpour swamped the area. The army was now essentially stationary. The wagons carrying the supplies, already having a tough time in the dense forest, were now essentially immobile. Varus ordered the army to make camp. Here, Varus met with his commanders and received reports on the earlier ambush. Casualties were light, but the baggage trains and the scout cavalry, two extremely important aspects of the Roman legion, were both hit the hardest. Varus and his generals decided a night march was needed to attempt to get out of the danger zone. They were sitting ducks, and they knew it. This proved to be a mistake, as Arminius had anticipated the move and set up another ambush just a little bit further ahead. The Germans made excellent use of the terrain, and chose a spot whereby the Romans only had a few hundred feet on either side to march in. To add to this, the road had been blocked, and a massive earthen wall had been constructed along one side of the road. The Germans attacked as soon as the Romans were within eyesight. The Romans attempted to storm the wall, but failed. Numonius Valla, the highest-ranking officer after Varus, attempted to retreat, but died in the process, and at that point, Roman defeat was essentially sealed. The Romans panicked, and the Germans charged from all sides. Many of the Roman commanders, including Varus, committed suicide rather than face capture, while thousands of legionnaires died. All three legions were completely destroyed, and the Germans did not stop there. With the main Roman forces in the region destroyed, they swept across this new imperial province, destroying Roman forts and garrisons all across the area. It was only due to a bit of luck, along with the arrival of Tiberius with reinforcements, that the Germans were unable to cross the Rhine. The Romans would have their revenge just a few years later when Germanicus Julius Caesar, the son of Drusus, led a successful retaliatory campaign, destroying Arminius and his armies. However, the damage had been done. The impact of this battle is still a hotly debated topic among historians, but it did seem to seriously temper Roman ambitions to conquer Germania. In fact, it seemed to temper Roman ambitions to conquer most everything. After this battle, the Roman spirit of conquest died down heavily. The Rhine was reinforced, and it would serve as the border between Rome and the Germanic tribes for centuries to follow. While the Romans did lead several campaigns into the region in the centuries following the battle, none were as extensive nor as committed to conquering as the campaign by Tiberius. Some historians will simply say that Rome had reached its zenith in terms of ability to control territory, and that it was simply that realization that stopped the conquering. And to be fair, they certainly have a point, but the defeat at the Teutoburg Forest should not be underestimated as a strong factor in urging Roman restraint when it came to conquering Germania. Losing 3 legions was a humiliation for Rome, something really only matched by the Battle of Cumae centuries earlier, and it would leave a mark on the Roman spirit for the rest of the empire. Conspiracy theories are sometimes great. I really do believe that. Sure, the ones about pedophiles controlling everything, or every election that doesn't go your way being stolen, are stains on our society that shouldn't be seriously entertained. But conspiracy theories also have a way of pulling people into something that they may have not even considered looking into. I'm not talking about the crazy 45-year-old Southern man who believes that aliens or the Democrats are going to harvest his brain. I can say that as a Southern man who has actually heard someone say that before. I'm talking about the person who sees some outrageous claim and decides to actually do their own research into the topic, where they frankly normally find that outrageous claim is batshit insane. This next entry is exactly my point. I first saw this on Twitter, and no, I won't call it X, where all good conspiracy theories start. I'll see if I can find the original tweet I saw and flash it up here, but essentially it was this woman claiming that the Roman Empire was not real, and Rome actually left no mark on history. At first, I just laughed and went on about my day, but I eventually saw another tweet on the topic, this time with a link to a TikTok. From there, I discovered that there are actually people, or at least seemingly people, who genuinely claim that Rome did not exist. Some claim that it just didn't exist, and that all the monuments, archaeological evidence, and so on was simply one large psyop. For what purpose, I'm not really sure. Another one claimed that the Spanish Inquisition invented Rome to unify Roman Catholics and/or give legitimacy to the church. My favorite of that person's points was, why did Rome not write in Roman? Why did they write in Latin? Which frankly just is hilarious. There's also some theories about Roman architecture being Greek and something about the alphabet, blah 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 blah. To be honest, it's so extremely stupid that it's actually funny. And let me be the first to say that Rome was real. I don't quite know how the city of Rome could exist if the Roman Empire didn't, but anyway. Also, if the empire didn't exist, did the Republic, or the kingdom for that matter? Where did the Colosseum come from? What about the Roman Forum? And what about the fact that historians outside of the Roman Empire recorded it as existing? And further, what is the site of Pompeii? I can really go on, but I do want to take a moment here to genuinely be serious. It is dangerous for our society for someone to try and warp a view of ancient history in this way. While we can joke and laugh at the obviously crazy person online, this sort of lying and manipulation is a problem. These people talk with such authority that it's easy for someone to be like, well, okay, maybe they are actually onto something. And that's dangerous. It is dangerous for people who are not educated to speak on things that they have, frankly, no qualification to speak on. It's the type of intellectual dishonesty that can lead to more serious consequences. While I doubt any violence will spawn from some random person on TikTok claiming that Rome didn't exist, this type of conspiracy theory can serve as a gateway into much more serious and much more dangerous conspiracies. Or this theory could easily spiral out of control and become that much more dangerous conspiracy. After all, if they, I guess meaning the government or whatever all-powerful, all-knowing organization is continuing to claim that the Roman Empire existed, can make up something so influential on society, then that naturally leads to a question of, well, what else is fake? What other aspects of culture, society, and government are simply constructs made to advance some secret agenda? It's that type of thinking that leads to the more dangerous territory. I'll leave a link to a great video on this subject by a great YouTuber, the Lady of the Library, down in the description. She is much more articulate than myself, and she does a great job of really ripping apart many of the claims by this TikToker, or whatever you call them. Damn, I'm getting old. So I want to leave this section off with this. Do not believe everything you hear on the internet. It's so incredibly easy to simply pick up a phone, record some stupid conspiracy theory, and gain a following on TikTok, YouTube, or any other social media app. You should never take one person's word as gospel, not even your resident idiot. Look at other sources, pick up a book, look in other corners of the internet. Just do something to find other viewpoints and to find other evidence. The internet is one of, if not the greatest invention in the history of humankind. It has increased the overall level of human knowledge in a way that nothing else ever has. You have the sum of human knowledge at your fingertips. Don't waste that opportunity on crazy people on TikTok. Now to my favorite, and apparently fake if we are to believe that last entry, Roman Emperor. Julian the Apostate, Flavius Claudius Julianus, more famously known as Julian the Apostate due to his rejection of the Christian religion, was born in Constantinople. He was the half-nephew of Constantine the Great. Julian was probably raised as a Christian. He very nearly met his end at a young age, when his cousin, Constantius II, led a massacre of most of the living male descendants of Constantine. He did this to secure his power, and by the end of the massacre, only Constantius, his brothers Constantine II and Constans, Julian, and Julian's half-brother Constantius Gallus were left standing. Julian and his half-brother were probably only spared because they were simply too young to be a threat. Julian was around 6 years old, and Constantius was about 11. Both were kept under strict guard, and mostly kept from public view after the massacre. Julian would be raised in Asia Minor in a sort of semi-exile. He was educated by various bishops, and seems to have truly been a Christian. It was only when he turned 20 that he began to embrace the old Roman religion. We don't really have much sourcing for this time in his life, but whatever happened, he himself states that, quote, he had spent 20 years in the way of Christianity, and 12 in the true way, meaning traditional Roman religion. In 354, Julian was recalled to the court of Constantius II, the last remaining emperor. Constantine II had died in 340, Constans in 350, and Constantius Gallus had been executed in 354, after very briefly ruling as Caesar of the East. Constantius's court was in Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, and for 2 years Julian was kept under watch to ensure that he was loyal and not going to rebel against Constantius. Julian would be cleared, and in 354 Constantius appointed him Caesar of the West, and he was even married to Constantius's sister, Helena. It seems as though Constantius really wanted Julian to be more of a figurehead rather than an actual Caesar, but unluckily for Constantius, Julian embraced his new role. Julian then led several campaigns against the Germans before being hailed as Augustus in Paris in 360. This was mostly due to the fact that Constantius had ordered many of Julian's troops to leave Gaul and join him in the east. This was likely an attempt to stem Julian's growing influence. Julian's actions in the next few years are a little strange. At times he seems to be in true revolt, and even uses the title of Augustus, while at others he seems to be doing what he was doing before this whole mess, and mostly just fighting various native peoples that threatened Rome's security. Whatever the case, by June of 361, Julian was well and truly in revolt, and the two sides seem to have been gearing up for a final confrontation somewhere in Illyricum. This would only be avoided when Constantius died in November of 361. At this point, Julian was the last remaining male heir to Constantius, and his claim was now unopposed. He entered Constantinople in 361 and was crowned as sole emperor. Julian wished to return to the days of Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, and so did not attempt to set up any sort of government resembling the triarchy, but he also didn't want to rule as an absolute monarch. He even went so far as to say that the ideal ruler was a primus inter pares, or first among equals. You can see him hearkening back to the days of Augustus with this title. Julian even debated laws and policies in the Senate of Constantinople, and even sat among the Senate during these sessions. Julian also believed the empire needed to be decentralized. He gave more powers to cities by returning the control of city land to local authorities, instituting new city councils who held civic authority, and made tribute given to the state voluntary. Yet Julian did retain some authority, and most new laws, taxes, and related items had to be personally cleared by him to take effect. Julian's ideal Roman government was odd for the time, to say the least. He really believed that it should be individual cities and towns that make the civic decisions across the empire. The imperial government should really only be focused on enforcing laws and defending the empire from external threats. I guess you could call him kind of like a proto-federalist. He also started on a path towards reintroducing traditional Roman religion. He required school teachers to be approved by him. This allowed him to influence what was being taught in Roman schools. He also reopened many of the pagan temples in the empire, as well as restored much of the property taken from those temples. Many of the privileges that had been granted to Christians by the previous emperors were rescinded, including the stipends given to some bishops and churches from the state coffers. But Julian was unable to fully complete his reforms, as his attention was needed elsewhere. His position was still a little shaky. While he could rely on the Western army, after all they had been supporting him against Constantius, the Eastern army was a bit of an unknown. Julian determined he needed to lead the Eastern army on a campaign against the Sassanids to try and woo them, so to speak. The goal was to secure a quick victory and use the glory, prestige, and most importantly new wealth from the victory to secure the loyalty of the Eastern army. With that done, there couldn't really be any serious challenges to his rule. This didn't happen. The invasion was a disaster, and the Romans were in full retreat basically from the moment of engagement. Julian would be seriously wounded by a spear during one such confrontation, and this wound would eventually cause his death only a few days later. Julian never really got much of an opportunity to leave behind a legacy. In fact, if it wasn't for the simple fact that he was public about his conversion to Roman paganism, he probably wouldn't be remembered for all that much. But for me, Julian represents a turning point in Rome's history. I see him as a sort of last hurrah for traditional Roman religion and culture. After him, the empire becomes much more Christianized, and while Rome was still Rome, it was different. If he had only succeeded in Persia, who knows what would have happened? Perhaps we would have seen a resurgence in traditional Roman religion, or perhaps the empire would have been torn apart by a series of new civil wars, but this time, instead of competition for political power, it would be for the cultural and religious character of the empire. We will never know, but I truly believe that Julian is one of the empire's greatest what-ifs. The cult of Mithraism, also known as the Mithratic Mysteries, was a Roman mystery religion. That makes it sound so grand, but really it just means that the inner workings of the religion were only taught to inductees or initiates. Imagine if today's Christianity only allowed those who had been inducted into the religion to read the Bible. It's a pretty similar concept to this cult. The cult was centered around the deity known as Mithras. The cult was pretty popular among the Roman military in the first few centuries AD. In fact, it seems as though the cult competed with Christianity to become the dominant faith within the imperial army, and perhaps even Roman society as a whole. The origins of the cult are still a pretty hotly debated topic among historians and archaeologists. For a long time, really only until the last couple of decades, the agreed upon origin was Persian. Mithra, as the god would be known in Persia, was a god of some importance in Zoroastrianism. While not as important as, say, Ahura Mazda, the creator god and chief deity in Zoroastrianism, Mithra was still important. Mithra's origins can be traced back to much earlier native Iranian religions. In fact, in a 15th century BCE tablet made to record a treaty between the Hittites and the Mitanni, Mithra is invoked in his power as god of oaths. Mithra was absorbed into the Zoroastrian religion early in its history, as a compromise to unite those that still followed the traditional faiths and the new Zoroastrians. Mithra is traditionally associated with light, oaths, justice, the sun, contracts, and really all sorts of interpersonal relationships. Think friendships, family bonds, etc., that sort of thing. It's difficult to tell just how important or how much influence Mithra held in Zoroastrianism, but we do know that he was accepted as being a deity in the religion. I should note here that I'm talking specifically about ancient Zoroastrianism. Today's Zoroastrianism is a much different religion, with today's version being much more monotheistic when compared to the ancient version. Today, though, that theory is viewed with more skepticism. I can't get too deep into the debate, but it mostly centers around the fact that the two gods as we know them are obviously different in terms of values, domains, and cult actions. The other main issue is that our archaeological findings seem to indicate that the cult spread from Italy out into the wider empire. If we believe that, then it seems kind of odd that Persian religion could have spawned such a cult. Whatever the case, it seems that some Romans began to worship Mithra sometime around the turn of the millennium. While the worship of the god would become popular in the army around the 1st century AD, Plutarch tells us that in 67 BCE, some worship of the god was already in full swing in the region of Cilicia, which is in the southeast of modern-day Turkey. However, this is really just based on Plutarch's word, and has not yet been fully backed up by archaeology. Just a few centuries after this, cult locations would spring up all across the empire, from Britain in the west to Judea in the east. Now, because the religion was a secret one, that is, a religion that requires initiation, we are missing a lot of information on the inner workings of the cult. We know that one of the most important aspects of the religion was the killing of a bull. This is something we see near universally in the surviving artwork, descriptions, and so on pertaining to the cult of Mithras. While we don't know for sure what exactly it was meant to represent, most historians tend to agree that it probably has something to do with rebirth. Bulls were seen as symbols of strength and fertility in Rome really since the time of Romulus, and many historians postulate that the death of the bull was meant to represent some form of new life being given to either the initiate or simply the world as a whole. The cult had 7 degrees of membership, with each tier seemingly being connected to an original Roman deity. These will be on the screen in front of you. We're not totally positive what these degrees of membership really represented. We aren't sure, for instance, if every initiate received a rank, or if just a priestly class did. And further, we are unsure what exactly each grade conferred onto a person in terms of privileges, rights, and that sort of thing. We do know that each initiate into a grade seemingly had to pass some sort of test that involved some kind of peril. We also know that in many ceremonies, the activities of various deities would be reenacted with members of different grades serving as the god in question. For instance, if a ceremony called for a reenactment of some sort of event between the god Sol and Saturn, then a person from the Heliodromos grade would play Sol, while someone from the Pater grade would play Saturn. And that's really about all that we know. We don't know much, for instance, on who would be allowed into the cult. The membership lists that remain intact only include male names, but it's certainly possible that women were allowed into the cult, as some artwork does show women as being involved. Further, we know that the cult was very popular among the Roman military, and it seems as though basically anyone could join, provided they received an invite. This would make sense with the Roman military, as many auxiliaries weren't quite Roman. And we also don't really know what the ethics or morals of the cult were either. We do know that the cult began to seriously decline in membership and importance in the 4th or 5th century AD. Christianity simply won out in the end, and the cult of Mithras was suppressed and finally ended during the reign of Theodosius in the last years of the 4th century. The cult was seemingly one of the last hurrahs for paganism in the empire, but in the end it was eventually defeated by the rising tide of Christianity. The Catilinarian conspiracy was an attempted coup by Lucius Sergius Catilina against the consuls for the year, Marcus Tullius Cicero and Gaius Antonius Hibernia in 63 BCE. Catilina had lost in the consular elections, and, probably embittered about his defeat, put together a fairly large coalition of malcontents. This included other aristocrats who had some bone to pick with Cicero or Hibernia, veterans of Sulla that had been ignored or even persecuted by the Roman government since his death, and, weirdly, dispossessed farmers. Cicero would apparently uncover the plot in November of 63 and accuse Catilina of plotting to seize the consulship. Catilina would flee with a fairly decent-sized army to Etruria. Cicero would further discover another 9 co-conspirators and would put them to death without a trial, something that would forever tarnish his image and eventually be used against the Republican government by Julius Caesar. Catilina would be defeated by Hibernia in the next year, and the conspiracy would officially be put to rest. The main theory we want to look at today is that this whole event was fabricated. The first issue here is that both of our sources for the event, Sallust's Monograph Bellium Catilinae and Cicero's Catilinarian Orations, are both extremely biased accounts. It's argued that Cicero exaggerated the threat of the Catilinarian conspiracy as a way to gain some sort of political advantage. This does seem to track, as even later ancient sources acknowledge that Cicero used the event for his own political advantage by painting himself as a defender of Rome and its republic. But I think the key here is the word used. I don't think the conspiracy was fake, or even orchestrated by Cicero or his allies. Instead, I think Cicero used the conspiracy as a way to enhance his own personal reputation and political power. There probably was a plot against the consuls, but it probably wasn't all that much of a threat. I personally believe that Cicero simply seized the moment and used the conspiracy to his own benefit. Although, this doesn't really explain his move to execute the 9 co-conspirators without a trial, something that Cicero should have been able to realize would have been unpopular. Perhaps he just assumed the public would be so grateful for ensuring the Republic remained standing that they would overlook a bit of extrajudicial killing. I don't know, and we probably never will. But the conspiracy was almost certainly real. However, it's quite possible that Cicero, shall we say, fanned the flames just a little bit. The Druids are, in my opinion, one of the most interesting aspects of Celtic society. While not technically Roman, the Druids were important in Roman history, and were seemingly the leading class of the Gauls. Our main source of information on the Druids is Julius Caesar, so take all of this with a bit of salt. The Druids were seemingly a high-ranking class, mostly made up of learned men and priests. They filled many roles in Celtic society, including priests, judges, librarians, historians, and even political advisors. The Druids were seemingly exempt from wars, and were more concerned with the social advancement of their people. They studied everything, from philosophy and astronomy, to medicine, and to the lore about their Celtic gods. they were seemingly a sort of proto-academic class for the Celts. We don't know a whole lot of particulars about the Druids, as the later Roman emperors, Tiberius and Claudius in particular, worked hard to ensure that the class was systematically oppressed, and then with the rising tide of Christianity, Druids were essentially driven to extinction. To add to this, many of the surviving sources that we do have are obviously biased against the Druids and their way of life. Caesar used them as evidence that Rome needed to conquer Gaul, painting them as savages that sacrificed humans. Other sources simply viewed them as primitives who needed to be enlightened, so to speak. Because of this, we have to be careful in examining these sources, as some information is likely made up or influenced by the author's personal views on the Druids. But we do know that the Druids were the chief priest of the Gauls, and likely most of the Celts. They were the overseers of sacrifices, rituals, and festivals, and they were the intermediaries between the divine world and the mundane world. Because of this, they often acted as important advisors to kings and important men who used them to perform a similar function to the augurs in Rome, that is, determining how the gods felt about a certain issue. But the Druids also held some civil roles as well. Caesar says that along with the equites of Gaul, likely meaning the noblemen, the Druids were the other respected class, and that they were given the power to judge disputes. The Druids were apparently led by a single Druid, who would serve until his death. The successor would, most of the time, be chosen by a vote among a council of the most senior Druids. This all apparently occurred somewhere within the territory of the Carnute tribe, within Gaul, an area in the center of Gaul. It seems that the Druids of Britain had a similar system, but it was separate from the Gallic system, and Caesar states that even the Druids of Gaul recognized Britain as the center of Druidic culture. There are some issues with Caesar's account, as the Druids are not mentioned during his Gaulish conquest, something that shouldn't be possible if the Druids were as influential as he makes them out to be in later sources. Because of this, the account is sort of in limbo, and we don't really know if the Druids were as influential as Caesar claims, or if that influence was created as a tool for propaganda by Caesar later in his life. While the political influence of the Druids may have been exaggerated, their social and cultural influence likely wasn't. They probably were leaders in the Celtic religion, and likely were leaders in the academics among the Celts. Sadly for the Druids, the Roman Empire would come down hard on the class, and a brutal campaign of repression would begin under Tiberius. This campaign would be continued by later emperors, and by the time of the Christianization of Britain in the 7th century, the Druids were almost certainly gone, and likely had been for some time. It's sad to think what history was lost because of the disappearance of the Druids, and their disappearance will likely always remain a tragedy of the empire. Agricola, born Gnaeus Julius Agricola, was a Roman general and governor of Britain who led the conquest of Wales, northern England, and even some portions of Scotland in the 1st century AD. We basically have no details about his early life, but we do know that he was born in Gallia Narbonensis, which was basically the southern part of Gaul. While his family was Gallic nobility, back in Rome his family was considered plebeian, or at least very close to it. He began his military career as an officer, serving in Gaius Suetonius Paulinus' general staff. Coincidentally, Gaius Suetonius not only led the campaign against Boudica in 61, something that Agricola almost certainly participated in, but he also led the Roman conquest of Anglesey, known as Mana then. Prior to the Roman conquest of Anglesey and the smaller Holy Island to its west, they both seemingly served as the Druidic strongholds in Britain. The island was even chosen for its initial conquest with the specific purpose of breaking the power of the Druid class in Britain. It didn't quite work then for Gaius Suetonius, but that's a story for another time. Back to Agricola. Agricola would go on to serve in Anatolia before being elected tribune of the plebs in 66 and then praetor in 68. Agricola, luckily for himself, chose the right side during the year of the 4 emperors in 69 and was rewarded by Vespasian, the eventual victor, with the command of the 20th Legion. The legion, known as the 20th Victorious Valeria Legion, had participated in a brief rebellion, or at least a small uprising, against the former governor of the province of Britain, and Agricola was sent to regain control over the legion. Agricola did just that, and led the legion in several successful campaigns against several British tribes. By this point, Agricola was a very well thought of figure back in Rome, and because of this he was even enrolled as a patrician and appointed governor of Gallia Aquitania. We don't know a whole lot about his time in Gaul, but he must have been fairly good at his job, as he was allowed to stay at his post for 3 years. In 76, he was appointed suffect consul, and frankly, the reason we know so much about him was because of another event that happened around this time. You see, we don't know a whole lot about his children, but he did have at least one daughter, as around the same time he was appointed suffect consul, he betrothed his daughter to the famous Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus would go on to write extensively about Agricola, and it's really his work that is our main source for his life. And finally, in 77 or 78, we aren't totally sure, Agricola would be appointed governor of Britain, and it was here that he would really begin to establish his legacy. Upon his ascension, he discovered that most of the Roman cavalry, stationed in Wales, had been destroyed in some sort of plot by a local tribe, the Ordovices. Agricola could not allow this to stand. Not only did this result in a decent amount of Roman troops being wiped out, but if the Romans didn't respond, it would only encourage the other local British tribes to attack Rome. So Agricola resolved to lead a campaign, and this campaign was fairly successful. He quite easily subjugated the Welsh. Although they technically weren't Welsh yet, but that's a story for another time. It was during this campaign that he actually finally conquered the island of Anglesey, and with that, finally destroyed what remained of the Druidic dominance of Britain. Agricola, though, was not content to simply rest, and he kept pushing his army further north. In 79, he began his push into modern-day Scotland. But 81 is when the story really gets interesting. Here we are told that Agricola, quote, crossed the Clota, and subdued in a series of victories tribes hitherto unknown, end quote. Now that is interesting. So what is the Clota, and what were the tribes hitherto unknown? Well, we don't really know for sure. But Clota is the name associated with a river goddess in Brittonic mythology. She was said to be the patron goddess of the River Clyde. The River Clyde is the second largest in Scotland, and today runs through Glasgow, the largest city in Scotland. This river would later go on to be the western end of the Antonine Wall, the wall intended to replace Hadrian's Wall. So, most historians are fairly confident that the River Clyde was the uncrossed river. If we assume that that is true, then it was likely the Damnanii, which were subjugated by Agricola. At the same time, Agricola apparently began to turn his vision towards Ireland, known then as Hibernia. And I'm sorry if I offend any Irish people in the audience, but Hibernia is so much cooler than Ireland. Tacitus, who was Agricola's father-in-law, so likely got the story straight from the man himself, tells us that Agricola received an exiled Irish king sometime during his conquest. The king hoped that Agricola, and by extension Rome, would invade Hibernia and return his kingdom to him. And actually, it seems like Agricola was pretty interested in such an option, and he apparently told Tacitus that it would only take a single legion to conquer the island. A pretty bold claim. So why didn't he do it? Well, we don't know, and sadly I can't speculate too much, or this video would be hours long. But we have no historical record, as of now, that definitively confirms Agricola ever leading an invasion into Ireland. Back in Scotland, though, Agricola was not done just yet, but it would be the native Caledonians that struck first. Apparently, they were a little concerned with the new Roman army that had just, for the first time, mind you, crossed into inner Scotland. We don't quite know how many tribes united together, but we do know that it was at least enough to threaten the Roman advance. The natives would strike the 9th Spanish Legion, and hey, that should sound pretty familiar, at nightfall. The army was caught completely unawares, but managed to rally just enough to hold the line within their fort. Word was sent to Agricola, who quickly ordered his cavalry to make with all haste to the fort. When the Caledonians saw the standards of the relief force, they began to waver, while the 9th Spanish Legion were emboldened. The fight quickly went sideways for the Caledonians, and they retreated back into the forest, an area where they knew the Romans would not follow them. This war would culminate in the Battle of Mons Graupius. We don't know where exactly this battle took place, but Tacitus tells us that at this point, the Caledonians had mustered as many men as they could, and had decided they were either going to be wiped out, or kick the Romans out of Scotland. Dramatic, I know. To be quite honest, this account is probably not real. For instance, he states that the Caledonian army was 30,000 strong, while the size of the Roman army was 8,000 allied auxiliaries, 3,000 cavalry, while the Roman legions remained in reserve. Now, surely an army of just over 10,000 couldn't take on an army of 30,000, right? Or even if they did, they would suffer horrific casualties, right? Well, Tacitus tells us that over 10,000 Caledonians died, while only 360 auxiliaries died. Now, just take a moment to think about those numbers. That is a ratio of 28 to 1. To put that another way, every time a Roman died, 28 Caledonians would have had to die to keep those numbers that high. And further, those 20,000 remaining Caledonians apparently just fled into the woods and were never seen again. That's interesting when you consider the fact that just a little bit ago, Tacitus told us that the Caledonians had decided to either kick the Romans out of Scotland or die trying. So then, why would the bulk of this force just decide to give up after one defeat? I don't know, this all sounds a little bit fishy to me. I won't contest that Agricola certainly did win some sort of victory. After all, he was awarded a triumph by the emperor himself, and seemingly well thought of even years after this battle, something that would have been difficult to do if he had made up the battle or the war. In any case, Agricola was said to have subdued all the tribes of Britain, and it seemed as though Rome would finally assert itself over the entire island. However, he was recalled in the year 85, and the command of the province and the legions would go over to Sallustus Lucilius. Following this, the empire needed those British troops elsewhere, and when the troops left, so too did any hope of truly controlling all of Britain. Tacitus blames this on the Emperor Domitian, essentially saying that Agricola had outshone him, and Domitian allowed Britain to slip away as a way to discredit Agricola's accomplishments. On the one hand, this kind of makes sense. We know that Agricola would never be granted another civil or military post, despite being one of the most qualified Romans on the planet. But at the same time, he did receive a triumph and a statue, which was at the time just below the honor of a triumph. Two things that Domitian certainly could have stopped from happening. Frankly, it's pretty difficult to say with any certainty just how the two felt about each other. Agricola would die in Gallia Narbonensis in 93. Tacitus tells us that he was just 53. He had conquered Britain, ascended to the Senate, and rubbed shoulders with the most powerful men in Rome. He was a hero to the public, and his legacy would be immortalized by his son-in-law. All in all, a pretty good life, if you ask me. Gordian III was a little-known emperor who reigned from 238 to 244. His mother, Antonia Gordana, was the daughter of the Emperor Gordian I, and the younger sister of Gordian II. Gordian I and II were proclaimed joint emperors in Africa in 238. The two would die in just 22 days. Notably, though, the two were supported by the Roman Senate. You see, at the time, the Senate was in conflict with Maximinus Thrax, and they looked to the two Gordians as a way to overthrow him. But it didn't work out. Gordian II would die in the Battle of Carthage, while Gordian I would commit suicide just a short time later. So, Gordian III, at the time a young child, was in a bit of a bad position. Luckily, or maybe unluckily for him, the Senate would appoint him as Caesar shortly after the death of the previous two Gordians. Two men would be appointed to serve as co-emperors, while Gordian III would eventually succeed one of them. These two men have quite possibly the most unfortunate names for any Roman emperors. They were Pupienus and Balbinus. I'm not kidding. Rather unfortunate, if you ask me, and frankly, I would have used the opportunity to change my name. But they probably didn't really consider what we would think about their names some 2,000 years later. Maximinus Thrax, the Roman emperor before the Senate and the Gordians decided to rebel, was not happy with this arrangement, and began a march to Rome to put down the revolt. He would never make it, and would be assassinated by his own troops at Aquileia. But, sadly for our two unfortunately named emperors, this wouldn't make them the undisputed emperors, and they would both be killed by the Praetorian Guard the month after Maximinus' death. Gordian III would then be proclaimed emperor in 238. There was one small problem though. Gordian was 13. Yes, 13 years old. I could barely be trusted to go to the store by myself at 13, much less rule a country. So, Gordian, who was the youngest person ever to be proclaimed sole emperor of the empire, was essentially made a figurehead. The Senate, along with the aristocratic families of Rome and the Praetorian Guard, really ruled the state. For a while, Gordian was actually doing surprisingly well. There were a few revolts, but nothing too serious, and they were put down. He would go on to marry the daughter of his praetorian prefect, Timesitheus, in 241. A pretty smart move for any emperor. And really, the worst thing to happen during his early reign was a series of earthquakes in Rome. These earthquakes were apparently so bad that Gordian consulted the Sibylline books. This changed in 241, when Gordian, who was now about 16, opened the doors to the Temple of Janus and declared Rome to be at war. This war was in the east, against the Sassanid Empire under Shapur I. Shapur had invaded Mesopotamia and had seemingly overran the Roman garrison in the province. The war waged on for about 2 years, until the Romans finally defeated the Sassanids at the Battle of Racania in 243. The Sassanids were driven back over the Euphrates, and Gordian celebrated his own triumph. It's unknown just how much or how little Gordian was involved in the actual war, but he is recorded as taking part in several of the battles. At some point, either just after the Battle of Racania, or possibly even during it, Gordian's praetorian prefect and father-in-law would die, and this left the young emperor in a vulnerable position, and may have even been what actually ended the war with the Sassanids. In any case, a man by the name of Marcus Julius Philippus would step into the role shortly thereafter. You probably don't recognize that name, and I don't blame you, as he's more well known as Philip the Arab. If you know who Philip the Arab is, then you probably know where this story is going. In 244, Gordian would start a second campaign against the Sassanids. This campaign did not go nearly as well as the first, and the Romans would be completely stopped at Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sassanids. Here we are told that the soldiers proclaimed Philip the Arab as emperor following the army's defeat, and that he was forced to make peace with Shapur on, quote, shameful terms. Apparently, on the way back west, Gordian somehow died. Or, at least that's the official story. An inscription made by Shapur claims that the two sides participated in a battle, which the Sassanids won, and that Gordian died during that battle, and that Philip the Arab paid some 500,000 dinars, a unit of currency, to Shapur in exchange for peace. Another source claims that Gordian was murdered by his troops, and Philip was proclaimed emperor afterwards. But in any case, the second campaign ended with Gordian III dead, and Philip as emperor. Gordian is mostly simply known for being the youngest emperor, but beyond that, he was really just a kid who got caught up in the political schemes of Rome and was frankly in over his head. The Eleusinian Mysteries, similar to the cult of Mithra, was another mystery religion. This one, though, had its origins in ancient Greece. The exact origin is debated. Some studies claim an origin in the Mycenaean period, others claim origin from a Bronze Age agrarian cult, and others claim Minoan origins. Whatever the case, the cult likely predated the Greek Dark Ages, a period from around 1100 BCE and 750 BCE. The cult was based around Demeter and her daughter Persephone, both of which were considered earth goddesses. The cult came to Rome sometime during the Republic, and we know that it was thriving under Augustus, and there is even some evidence that Augustus himself was inducted into the cult. Other great Romans who participated in the cult include Plutarch, Hadrian, and even Marcus Aurelius. The last recorded Roman emperor to participate in the cult was Julian the Apostate, although it's a little unclear just how involved Julian was in the cult and how similar that cult was to the original Greek cult. The cult was centered around the kidnapping of Persephone by Hades and the journey of Demeter, Persephone's mother, to find her daughter in the underworld. To be honest, this mystery cult has pretty much succeeded in keeping hidden what their rituals and activities actually were. We know that most initiates marched in a procession from Athens to Eleusis, seemingly the center of the cult in Greece. We aren't quite sure if that tradition remained for all of the cult's history, but there is some evidence to suggest that it did. We do know for sure that the initiation became a state activity sometime around 300 BCE, and two Greek families, the Eumolpidae and the Kerykes, were given a sort of stewardship over the cult. We know that at this point an initiate had to have never committed murder, and they had to have been able to speak Greek. It seems like men, women, and possibly even slaves were allowed into the cult, assuming they fulfilled those requirements, and they swore an oath of secrecy. We also know the names of a few different priesthoods and the names of the groups of participants. You can see those on the screen in front of you. Further, we know that there were two different main festivals, the Greater Mysteries and the Lesser Mysteries. We aren't 100% positive, but it seems like the lesser mysteries were more focused on the miseries and the issues of life, while the greater mysteries were more focused on the purification of the soul and a great rebirth of life. As you can imagine then, the lesser mysteries took place in the middle of winter, while the greater mysteries took place in late summer. And frankly, that's about all we know for sure. There are more speculations, and I'll leave a link to a great video on the subject by one of my favorite YouTubers, Let's Talk Religion, down in the comments if you want more information. Roman expeditions refer to several different expeditions and explorations into sub-Saharan Africa undertaken by various Roman emperors, private citizens, and commercial interests. By the 1st century BCE, Romans had been present in North Africa for centuries. Carthage had been conquered in the previous century, while the kingdoms of Numidia and Cyrenaica were either full vassal kingdoms of Rome or falling further and further under Rome's influence. However, Rome's influence had been contained by one of Earth's greatest natural barriers, the Sahara Desert. The Sahara is the largest hot desert in the world. It stretches from one end of Africa to the other, and there is a reason the Sahara has served as the unofficial dividing line in Africa for centuries. It's nearly completely inhospitable, with temperatures regularly reaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sand itself reaching temperatures over 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Even today, with all the great technological marvels the world has developed, the Sahara is estimated to only contain roughly 2.5 million people, which is about 0.4 people per square mile. To give you a little bit of perspective, the Sahara is roughly 3.5 million square miles. That's about 400,000 square miles larger than the contiguous United States. But the population of the contiguous United States is 328 million. A density of 111 people per square mile. If we add in Alaska and Hawaii, the size of the United States jumps to about 3.7 million square miles, which is slightly larger than the Sahara, and the population jumps from 328 million to about 331 million, which is a density of 96 people per square mile. I say all this in the hope of showing you just how inhospitable and uninhabited the desert is today. In the time of the Romans, those numbers would have been even lower. I will quickly note here that this does not, contrary to popular belief, mean that the Sahara was without a population, or even great civilizations during history. Far from it, cultures such as the Kiphians and the Tenarians all survived and even thrived in the Sahara. To be honest, there is a rich history here that one day I would love to examine in more detail, but it is important to counter the modern-day notion of sub-Saharan Africa and Saharan Africa as an area without great civilizations, cultures, social organizations, and so on. I will leave some resources that talk a bit more about some of the cultures in the description, but I think it's important to realize that there were people in the Sahara, and there were even civilizations in the Sahara at the time of the Romans. They were simply few and far in between. The Romans likely first learned about the area south of the Sahara from men like Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian who sailed around the western coast of Africa. Hanno certainly made it to southern Morocco, but many historians claim he may have even reached modern-day Gabon. Pliny the Elder and Arrian, two Roman historians of the period, both mention Hanno in their works. This indicates that the Romans at least believed that something was beyond the Great Sea of Sand. Further, we know that Rome traded with the kingdoms of Eritrea, northern Africa, and Ethiopia, all of which we know traded with kingdoms deeper into Africa's interior. It's likely then that stories of gold and spices easily reached Roman ears from their traders in kingdoms like Aksum and Ethiopia. This all eventually motivated the Romans to seek out those kingdoms. There are 5 main explorations that we know of. Some of these are near universally agreed upon to have taken place, while others are, shall we say, doubted, or at least viewed with more skepticism. So let's quickly take a look at each expedition. The first expedition we have a record of is one led by Cornelius Balbus in 20 or 19 BCE. We are told by Pliny the Elder that Balbus planned to conquer. He took with him a force of infantry and swapped the normal horses and mules for camels, probably a smart move considering just where he was looking to go. Balbus seems to have been inspired to invade by various Roman merchants in the area around modern-day Libya. It was an area in which a local group had established a fairly influential kingdom. These people, called the Garamantes, had settled in the area of Libya by at least 1000 BCE and had established themselves as a kingdom on the edge of the Sahara. We know that they engaged in raids on Roman coastal towns, and we know that some Roman trade routes were either raided by the Garamantes or were extorted for protection, as the caravans made their way to their destinations. This is seemingly the reason given by Pliny to motivate Balbus to launch his expedition, but there is some evidence that the Garamantes also acted as a sort of intermediary between the Romans and sub-Saharan Africa, something that would have almost certainly attracted Roman attention. I would venture to guess that the real reason for Balbus's expedition is likely a mixture of the two. In any case, Balbus first marched to the Garamantes' capital of Galmara. Here he easily conquered the city, and forced the Garamantes to agree to stop extorting Roman trade, and we are told that he occupied some mercantile routes for the advantage of the Romans. It's a little unclear what exactly this means, but it probably means that the Romans took over, or at least were guaranteed access to local trade routes that the Garamantes had excluded them from. From here, the expedition is a little harder to follow. We know that Balbus, likely of his own accord, sent some of his men to explore the, quote, land of lions, which probably referred to the land beyond the Hoggar Mountains in modern-day Algeria. These men apparently followed the caravans on their trade routes and returned with maps, guides, and likely first-hand accounts of the region. We know that Balbus came to the city of Cadamus, known today as Gadamus, which at the time was a large oasis and likely served as a checkpoint for various trade routes in and out of the Sahara. Pliny tells us that he continued on, and apparently even reached a, quote, large body of water, which was probably the Niger River. There is evidence of Roman coins in the region. However, it's frankly hard to say how accurate this telling by Pliny is. We can be fairly certain that Balbus did move against the Garamantes, but did he journey all the way to the Niger River? Well, despite the evidence of Roman coins, it's kind of a toss-up among modern historians. It is certainly possible that Balbus could make it to the Niger River. Groups in the Sahara had been making that trip for centuries at this point. But Balbus was also only a proconsul for a year, and upon him leaving office, his authority to conduct such an expedition would have been gone, and his men would have been duty-bound to either stay in place or return to Rome to receive a new commander. It's really hard to say how true this account is, so for now, let's count this one as possible, but not unquestionable. The second expedition occurred just a few decades later, in 41 AD. This expedition was led by Suetonius Paullinus. Yes, you might recognize that name if you watched the last episode, as this guy was the guy who fought Boudicca back in Britain. He really gets around, doesn't he? In any case, in 40 AD, Suetonius was appointed as governor of Mauritania, an area roughly equating to modern-day northern Morocco. At around the same time, a man named Adaemon launched a revolt against Roman occupation. Adaemon was likely a Berber, the peoples native to the region. He had been a loyal slave to the king Ptolemy of Mauritania. Ptolemy was a client of the Roman state, but had been murdered under strange circumstances while in Rome, likely on the orders of the Roman Emperor Caligula. Adaemon likely launched this rebellion as a response. We don't know how many locals joined him, but it was seemingly a decent portion, as it required the attention of Suetonius, a noted Roman general of the time, and Gnaeus Hosidus Geta, again a noted Roman general. The two led a apparently brutal campaign that destroyed a number of the cities in the region and resulted in the deaths of a, quote, large number of Berbers. In any case, the war is not really what we're here to talk about. Instead, we are here to talk about Suetonius' route during the war. During the war, Suetonius was the first Roman to lead an army across the Atlas Mountains, a range that had served as the Roman frontier since they came into control of the area in around 33 BCE. Pliny actually gives us his first-hand account in his book, The Natural History. Here he says that Suetonius not only summited the mountains, but also crossed to the foot of the mountains on the other side. I'll put the full quote up on the screen, but what we really want to focus on is the last sentence of the quote, where Pliny tells us, quote, he proceeded some distance beyond it, as far as a river which bears the name of Gare. We don't know what the river Gare is, although the two most popular candidates are the Niger River or the Senegal River, although some historians actually suggest that Suetonius visited both, in that he at first came to the Gare River and then to the Senegal River. There is some evidence that it would be the Niger River though, because in Berber there is actually a phrase called the Ger en Ger, meaning river of rivers. So perhaps Ger en Ger was translated to the river Ger, meaning the Niger River. But frankly, we just don't know for sure. Again, Roman coins and artifacts have been discovered in both regions, especially in the area of Actric, which I probably butchered that, which is a small city in western Mauritania and only a few hundred miles from the Senegal River. And of course we've already mentioned some areas along the Niger River. This expedition does seem to be more accepted among modern historians. Firstly, it's almost certainly true that the man crossed the Atlas Mountains. The war probably forced him to do so, as Agamemnon and the locals would have simply retreated into the mountains if/when they faced defeat. His expedition past the mountains is probably more accepted simply due to the fact that he was a contemporary of Pliny the Elder. In fact, Pliny literally quotes the man. This, combined with the fact that the artifacts found in Asgut are seemingly from the correct time period, it seems almost certain that Suetonius at least made it to the area around Akshut, and likely to the Senegal River. I would fairly safely say that we can consider this expedition likely true. Our next expedition was led by a man named Septimus Flaccus. We know comparatively much less about this expedition, or really expeditions when you compare them to our previous two. But we do know that Septimus was a Roman general, who sometime in the 1st century AD apparently led a Roman expedition to the Lake of Hippopotamus. This was the name given by Ptolemy, one of the main geographers of the time, to Lake Chad. This expedition almost certainly occurred before 90 AD, as it was then that Ptolemy would name the lake as such, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. Septimus journeyed through the lands of, and was likely led by, the Garamantes. It apparently took 3 months to travel to the lake. But one journey wasn't enough for Septimus, as Ptolemy tells us that he journeyed to the region again in 50 AD, but this time Septimus was leading a campaign against some unnamed nomadic raiders who had attacked the Roman city of Lepidus Magna. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of these rivers, as quite frankly I will almost certainly butcher them, but I'll list them on the screen in front of you. Each of these rivers fed into Lake Chad, and Lake Chad was likely the final destination of this second expedition. Ptolemy also tells us that just a few decades later, another Roman, named Julius Maternus, would also lead an expedition into the same region. Julius would apparently travel with the king of the Garamantes, and eventually come to these two rivers, which I again won't try to pronounce as I will easily butcher them. It was said that Julius returned to Rome with a rhinoceros with 2 horns. This actually lines up with some other historical evidence that we have, as it was under Domitian, who would have been ruling at the time, that the Colosseum first displayed a rhino, which may have been the one that Julius brought back to Rome. Some historians postulate that Julius was actually a Roman diplomat that was sent to the king of the Garamantes to improve trading relations, and followed the king while he campaigned against rebellious subjects, or against other native peoples. And that's really all that we have on these 2 expeditions. I think it's pretty likely the journey of Julius was at least partly accurate. The appearance of a rhino in the Colosseum is simply too much of a coincidence, and likely points towards at least some sort of expedition by Julius. The expedition of Septimus is one of these where I think we simply lack enough evidence to really say one way or the other. So we'll chalk these up to true on behalf of Julius, and maybe on behalf of Septimus. Our next expedition comes from a man named Valerius Festus. Pliny tells us that in 70 AD, Festus led an expedition to follow the route that Balbus had followed nearly 90 years earlier. We are told that Festus made it to the Air Mountains, and even as far as the Gadufawa Plain, and eventually even made it to the famous city of Timbuktu and the Niger River. And that's really about it. I again think that this one is a maybe, as we simply lack the information to decide one way or the other. So, what does this all mean in the grand scheme of things? Well, I think it's pretty clear that Rome tried, and likely even succeeded, in crossing the Sahara Desert. Of course, they likely never established any sort of permanent or even semi-permanent outpost, or even a trading post in the area. The natural challenge of the Sahara simply meant that such an outpost couldn't be secured, supplied, or even constantly replenished by the Romans without significant investment and effort. 2 things that Rome needed in much more pressing regions, like Germania and Britain, for instance. Instead, it's much more likely that these expeditions were an attempt to find new sources of gold and other important trade goods, something that the Romans likely did find. However, the cost and effort needed to secure those goods was simply too much, and so Rome never crossed the Sahara in force. Instead, they continued to rely on groups like the Garamantes to be a sort of middleman, something we can see in the continued existence of that kingdom into later centuries. But I don't think it's crazy to say that multiple Romans at least stepped foot in the areas around the Niger and Senegal rivers, and even Lake Chad. These expeditions likely furthered trading relations with the Garamantes, and probably explains why we find Roman coins and artifacts in these regions. I think we could certainly debate the significance and the depth of these interactions, but I don't think we can debate that they actually happened, and just that fact alone is important. It shows that not only Rome knew more about the world than we thought just a few centuries ago, but also that civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa were not only thriving, but rich and interesting enough for what was arguably the most powerful civilization in the world at the time to interact with. Something which I think challenges the conventional view on the area. This area of scholarship is rapidly developing, and I think we'll be in for some interesting discoveries over the next few decades. This one is pretty simple. Essentially, this comes from some historical evidence that shows that Mehmed II, after conquering Constantinople, journeyed to the ruins of Troy and boasted that he had avenged the city by conquering the Greeks. The idea being that the Turks, an Anatolian peoples, avenged the Trojans, another Anatolian peoples, by throwing the Greeks, the Byzantines, out of the region. And to be fair, he kind of has a bit of a point. The Byzantines were certainly Greek by this point, and the Turks were technically an Anatolian people. So I guess in a roundabout way, they did avenge the Trojans. Of course, in actuality, it's still debated just who the Trojans were. Some say they were Greek, some say Hittite, and some say a completely separate people. Add to this the fact that the Turks originated in Central Asia and had only been inhabiting Anatolia for roughly 400 years now, and you get a bit of a different picture. But it's still pretty interesting to think of Mehmed proudly proclaiming that he had avenged Troy, and it really makes me wonder just how different history would be if his successors had carried the same interest in Troy and recreating Rome that Mehmed had. The quote, "I have made but one mistake," refers to the alleged last words of the Roman Emperor Titus, who ruled from 79 to 81 AD. Titus was the heir to Vespasian, his father, who had emerged as the victor during the year of the Four Emperors. And he was actually the first Roman emperor to succeed his biological father on the throne. He died during a journey to Sabine territories, where he was said to have uttered his famous last words. It's also said that he was going to continue the sentence before he, died. First, let me just say that most of the time, save for some extreme circumstances, last words are almost never some glorious statement or some incredible reflection on a life well lived. Instead, they normally range from something fairly mundane, like, "Man, my chest kinda hurts," to various screams or even a slight whimper. To get serious and kind of morbid, death is normally not pretty, and this was especially true for the period. It's likely that Titus didn't actually say, "I have made but one mistake," right before he died. Instead, it's much more likely that those around him made it up, or that he either instructed them to say so, or he wrote the words down shortly before his death. But for the sake of the video, let's just assume he did actually say those words. First of all, seriously impressive to only have one mistake, and secondly, what did he mean, and what was the mistake? Well, there are some grand historical theories, ranging from affairs with Domitia Longia, the wife of his younger brother Domitian, to him not killing Domitian when he had the chance. This last theory mostly came about from the rumors that Domitian had been plotting the overthrow of Titus for years, and that Domitian even had some hand in his death. We do know that the two did not have much love for each other, and Domitian showed little reaction to Titus's death, and actually hurriedly returned to Rome to claim the emperorship. But truly, this could have referred to any event during Titus's life. Maybe he regretted not being able to stop the fire in Rome during the year 80. This fire would go on to burn for 3 days and nights, and massive parts of the city were destroyed, while many Romans died in the capital. Maybe he regretted being emperor at all. Perhaps he wished he had become co-emperor with his brother, or maybe even remained as a top military commander and relinquished political power to someone else. The point here is that everyone has regrets, and I would imagine a Roman emperor likely had more than the average person. So, in the end, we will never be able to know just what Titus was referring to. But if you ask me, those are some pretty awesome last words for history to ascribe to you. Maybe I should start working on my last words before I end up with something stupid like, "Hey, does anyone else think it smells like burnt toast in here?" Romans in Ireland refers to the idea that Rome had some sort of presence in Ireland, or Hibernia as they called it. This, of course, is most heavily associated with Agricola, someone we talked about last time, but the relations between the people of Ireland and Rome go back much further. It's almost certain that Rome and Ireland were trading with one another by the time of Claudius's invasion of southern Britain in 43. Ptolemy was also able to correctly identify the locations of coastal settlements and even the lands of some native Irish peoples, something that would have only been possible with either fairly extensive trading relations or some sort of Roman expedition to the island. We also find many Roman archaeological objects all across Ireland, including coins, jewelry, and other such items. But, truthfully, this is probably the extent of Roman presence in Ireland. There is no archaeological evidence that Agricola actually invaded the area, and no evidence that any other Roman did either. There is some literary evidence that Rome might have at least stepped foot on the island, with Juvenal, a Roman poet, claiming that, quote, arms had been taken beyond the shores of Hibernia, end quote. But it's also unclear what exactly this means. It could mean that Rome had conducted a military expedition, or maybe Rome had simply supplied some Irish army with arms to conduct their own campaign, or maybe he simply misidentified Ireland and the arms actually went to Caledonia or somewhere similar. We will probably never know for sure. For now though, our evidence point towards the Romans maintaining a healthy trade relationship with the Irish, but not much else. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was a Roman general and statesman who was sadly overshadowed in history by the, frankly, greater men around him. Our Lepidus was the son of another Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Yeah, they weren't all that creative with names. Lepidus Sr. had been a vocal opponent of Sulla and the Optimates faction within the Roman government, even briefly leading a failed rebellion against them and the Roman government in 78 BCE. This didn't seem to affect Lepidus Jr. all that much though. He joined the College of Pontiffs at a young age, and eventually became one of Julius Caesar's most fervent supporters. He was the last interrex of the Republic in 52 BCE. He was then appointed praetor in 49 BCE, and was even left in charge of Rome while Caesar went to defeat Pompey in Greece. Lepidus was instrumental in securing the appointment of Caesar to the post of dictator, and was rewarded with an appointment to pro-praetor of Hispania Superior. During his time in Spain, Lepidus crushed a revolt of the neighboring governor of Hispania Ulterior, and was even granted a triumph for his victory. In 46, he was rewarded with a consulship, and was even made Magister Equitum, or Master of the Horse, to Caesar himself, essentially making him second in command in Rome. This would actually be the last time that the Master of the Horse would hold military command, and really the last time that the office would be used in its original form. Apparently Lepidus had done a good enough job, as he was again appointed Master of the Horse in 44 when the Senate declared Caesar dictator for life. Of course, this would end just a month later, with the assassination of Caesar on March 15th, 44 BCE. Lepidus was actually one of the first members of the Roman government to respond to the assassination. He ordered troops to the Campus Martius, and at first intended to use those troops to punish Caesar's killers. However, he was talked out of it by Mark Antony, but it seemed that Lepidus was truly calling the shots at this moment. The troops responded to his command, and if he wished it, then they would have painted the Senate House red with blood. Okay, maybe that's a bit dramatic, but Lepidus certainly stepped into the vacuum left by Caesar's death, which was his right as Master of the Horse after all. Lepidus and Antony would both speak to the Senate the next day, where they would agree to amnesty for the senators in exchange for the two men keeping their offices and the reforms of Caesar staying in place. With no new dictator, Lepidus's position as Master of the Horse was basically useless, and so Lepidus was appointed Pontifex Maximus, the last person to hold the title under the Republic. You can probably see a theme here. Lepidus was really the last person to hold quite a few positions under the Republic. Following this, Lepidus would be sent to negotiate an agreement with the Boat King Sextus Pompey, the last surviving son of Pompey the Great. Following an agreement, the Senate would vote to give him his own Thanksgiving festival for the year, and actually give him the command of Hispania and Gallia Narbonensis. Lepidus would later enter into a political alliance with Antony, after the latter pissed the Roman Senate off by attempting to take command of Gaul from Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's killers, who had been sort of exiled from Rome itself. It would be around the same time that Octavian entered the picture. The three men would come to an agreement, and together form the Second Triumvirate. With this agreement, the Republic was well and truly dying. The consuls were put to the side in favor of direct rule by the three men. I'm not going to go too deep into the civil war that would follow, as quite simply Lepidus didn't play all that much of a role, but he agreed to hand control of several of his legions over to Antony and Octavian, and in exchange, He was confirmed as the ruler of Hispania and Gallia Narbonensis, and confirmed as Pontifex Maximus. He would also be given the position of consul, and would be the person to remain in Rome while Octavian and Antony continued the war in the east. Frankly, it was this move that doomed Lepidus to be a subsidiary in the triumvirate. Not only did he give up military power in the form of several legions, but he also gave up the public relations boost that being the conquering hero gave Antony and Octavian following their victories. Antony and Octavian were given all the glory, while Lepidus remained back in Rome. Lepidus would see Octavian usurp his provinces of Hispania and Gallia Narbonensis just a few years later, with the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BCE. In this treaty, Lepidus was given Africa and Numidia. Yeah, a bit of a downfall. Eventually, Lepidus would come to be more of a hindrance than a help to Octavian, and Lepidus would eventually see his legions defect to Octavian on the island of Sicily after a dispute over the island. Octavian would strip him of all his offices save for that of Pontifex Maximus, and really after this Lepidus faded from the public eye. His son would actually be executed for conspiring to assassinate Octavian, but he himself would be left alone. In fact, really the only thing he did in the last few years of his life was periodically return to Rome to vote in the Senate. It's said that Octavian, now Augustus, would always force Lepidus to vote last, an act that was seen as belittling. Lepidus would die in 13 BCE, and Augustus would finally take his last position, Pontifex Maximus, from him. While I think a lot of contemporary Romans viewed Lepidus as weak or incompetent, I really think that Lepidus was simply dealt a bad hand in life, and made a few bad decisions. He was surrounded by men who were simply destined to be greater than him. Julius Caesar, Octavian, Mark Antony, Cicero, the list goes on and on. These men were simply titans of Roman history. They were all supremely gifted, and simply outclassed Lepidus in most regards. And yet, Lepidus still did very well for himself. Let us not forget that for a moment it was Lepidus who held much of the power in Rome after Caesar's death. It was Lepidus who was second in command of Rome during Caesar's reign, and it was Lepidus who supplied much of the manpower needed for Antony and Octavian to triumph. In the end, though, Lepidus made two main mistakes. First, he gave in to the Senate during the time after Caesar's death, and second, he gave up too much military power to Octavian and Antony. One wonders how differently history would look upon Lepidus if he had punished those that assassinated Caesar that night. What if it had been Lepidus who led the Roman armies against Caesar's assassins in the Civil War? We will never be able to say, but I think that Lepidus is often overshadowed by those around him, and it's really a shame, as Lepidus was a great Roman, and a man who deserves to be remembered. The 12 Tables were the first written form of Roman law. They were promulgated in 449 BCE and displayed in the Roman Forum. The tables laid out the rights and duties of a Roman citizen, and formed the basis of Roman law for centuries. I've already made a video examining the tables in more detail, but I'll quickly go over them here, but check out that video if you want more information. Each table dealt with a specific aspect of Roman life. You can see each table in their relevant area on the screen in front of you. The tables touched on everything, from trials and courts to judgments to the rights of men and women, and even to the sacred laws of the gods themselves. I cannot possibly go over each table here, as quite simply we would be here for far too long. Instead, I will say that the 12 Tables might be the most influential pieces of writing in Rome's history. Today, we really fail to understand just how big of a deal it is that we can find written law with just a simple Google search, or a simple trip to the library. At this point in history, law was almost exclusively known and understood by an upper class. In the case of Rome, it was typically the priest, or perhaps the Senate. That opens up an easy lane for corruption and unequal treatment under the law. The 12 Tables, though, completely changed all of that. For the first time in Roman history, a citizen could simply walk to the forum and read exactly what rights they held, how they would be treated in a court, their rights in that court, and what punishment they might receive. It was frankly revolutionary. The tables would also go on to influence later law codes. The laws of Justinian, for example, were heavily influenced by the 12 Tables. Even today's system of law in the United States was influenced by the tables. James Madison used it as a resource in crafting the Bill of Rights. Hell, basically all of common or civil law can trace its origins back to the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables were one of Rome's most important writings. They greatly influenced Roman history, and frankly history as a whole, for millennia afterwards. They revolutionized how Romans interacted with their state, and even today, their influence can still be felt all across the Western world. Alba Longa was an important Latin city located in the Alban Hills. The Romans tell us that the city was the founder and leader of the Latin League. The city was said to be founded by Anchises, a son of the legendary Aeneas. The city's royal line would eventually result in the births of Romulus and Remus. Thus, the city was often looked at as a sort of primogenitor of the early city of Rome. Livy further tells us that several important Roman families, including the Julia and the Servilia, were all originally from the city of Alba Longa. According to Roman tradition, the city was the leader of the Latin League, and the most powerful Latin city during the rule of the first few Roman kings. Tullius Hostilius, Rome's third king, would go to war with the Albans. This war, described by Livy as a sort of civil war, would eventually result in a duel to the death among two sets of three brothers, the Curati and the Hurati. We aren't quite sure which side represented which, but Livy prefers the view that the Hurati were Romans while the Curati were Albans. This duel was done to avoid large-scale bloodshed, as both sides recognized that if the Latins sufficiently weakened themselves, the Etruscans or another Italic group could pounce on that weakness and conquer or subjugate the Latins and the Romans. In the end, the Roman set of brothers won the duel, and the Albans became a sort of vassal state to Rome. A short time after the conflict, Veii, Rome's eternal enemy, would attack the Roman state. As per the treaty, Rome called upon Alba Longa to help repel the attack. At first, it seemed that the Albans would indeed help their Roman brethren. However, the dictator of Alba Longa, a man named Medius Furius, had secretly made a pact with Veii, and when the battle began, Medius led his troops away, leaving the Romans alone. However, Rome managed to win the battle, and Tullius executed Medius. Following this betrayal, Tullius ordered the city of Alba Longa destroyed, with only the temples left standing. The population of the city was forcibly moved to Rome, more specifically the Caelian Hill. Tullius allowed the leading families of Alba Longa to become patricians, and inducted them into the Senate. And really, that's about all we hear of Alba Longa in traditional Roman stories. Our modern archaeology does paint a bit of a different picture. It had been long debated if the city actually existed, as quite simply, even by the time of the Republic, the exact location of the city had been lost to history. With modern techniques, we have been able to extensively search the Alban Hills for any evidence of cities the size of what Alba Longa was, and so far we've found nothing. We have found that there were a string of villages in the Alban Hills. These villages date from around 900 to 700 BCE, right in line to have been conquered or destroyed by the Roman kingdom. Interestingly, it seems as though the Alban Hills were actually a religiously important site for the Latins, and by extension Rome, that was, shall we say, embellished by Roman authors. For instance, we know that every year a large festival was held on Mount Albano, modern-day Mount Calvo. The mountain is the second highest mountain in the Alban Hills, and is the remains of an old volcano. This festival was held in honor of Jupiter, and the temple built on the mountain was one of, if not the most important pilgrimages a Latin could make. Further, we are also fairly certain that the worship of Vestia may very well have come from the Alban Hills in some way. Lavinium, the mother city of Alba Longa, is the city with the oldest evidence of worship of Vesta, and was, even into the Republic, oftentimes the site of pilgrimages by the Roman elite to sacrifice offerings to the goddess, and other household gods as well. So the history of the city is a bit of a mixed bag. According to the traditional Roman view, the city was one of the most important Latin cities, and was frankly the mother city of Rome. But archaeological evidence seems to counter that narrative. In any case, Alba Longa, or maybe just the Alban Hills, were extremely important and influential cultural sites that had a large part in shaping early Roman society. This is a bit of a repeat and not something I'll get too deep into. However, this refers to a surprisingly popular theory or conspiracy that Rome was somehow fake. I did a bit of a deeper dive into this in a previous episode, which I will link in the upper right hand corner and in the description, but yes, Rome, the kingdom, the republic, and the empire were all indeed real. The Sertorian War was a civil war fought between 80 and 72 BCE between two factions, the Sertorians and the Solons. The Sertorians were led by a Roman general named Quintus Sertorius, while the Solons were led by everyone's favorite pre-Caesarian dictator, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The war was sort of a continuation of the admittedly much more famous civil war between Sulla and Gaius Marius. Quintus Sertorius had been a supporter of Gaius Marius, and had actually served under the man himself during the war against Sulla. However, he had a sort of falling out with Gaius Marius the Younger, the son of Gaius Marius. The younger Gaius had been appointed consul despite not being old enough and not having held any other offices. This was done by Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, the new leader of the Marians after both Gaius Marius the Elder and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, the original leaders of the faction, had died. Carbo hoped to drum up support by hearkening back to the original leaders of the faction. This actually did work, and many of the veterans of the previous conflicts flocked to the banner of the younger Gaius Marius. However, Sertorius felt slighted, as he was a much more qualified choice. Not only had he supported the Marians since the beginning of the conflict, but he had followed the cursus honorum. Carbo, though, did not see it that way, and ordered Sertorius to journey to Hispania, where he would become the propraetor of the province. Sertorius had some sort of army at his back and managed to actually gain control of both Hispania Ulterior and Hispania Citerior from Gaius Valerius Flaccus, the previously appointed governor of both provinces. Sadly, though, for Sertorius, back in Italy, Sulla won the ensuing civil war and set out to mop up any Marian resistance. Sertorius attempted to fortify the passes in the Pyrenees, but before he was able to, Sulla arrived with a much larger army, and, with the help of a betrayal by a leading officer in Sertorius' army, managed to break through his blockades. Sertorius attempted to convince the Spanish tribes to fight for him, but was ultimately unsuccessful. With no other options, he abandoned Hispania, and with a group of about 3,000 or so men, fled into Mauritania, modern-day Morocco. He would eventually join up with a gang of pirates, which, yeah, that's a pretty serious fall from grace. These pirates, though, as pirates typically do, eventually moved on and helped to install a man named Aeneas Luscus, who was a supporter of Sulla, as king of Tangier, an important city in Mauritania that controlled the African side of the Strait of Gibraltar. Sertorius followed them into Tangier, but recognized that the locals were unhappy with Luscus, who was viewed as a bit of a tyrant. Capitalizing on this, Sertorius led a local rebellion that deposed Luscus. By this point, Sertorius was starting to make a bit of a name for himself, and those back in Hispania were beginning to rethink their support for him. This boiled over when in 80 BCE, the Lusitanians, a local Spanish tribe, asked Sertorius to lead them in war against the Sullian governor of Hispania. We aren't quite sure what caused this act of rebellion, but it was likely over the amount of tribute that the Lusitanians needed to pay to the Romans, or some other similar issue. Sertorius led his remaining men across the strait, and landed at Bailio Claudia, a town right beside the famous Pillars of Hercules. Here he began to gather the Lusitanians and the local Spanish tribes into his army. He fought a battle at the Baetis River, which we know next to nothing about the specifics, but we do know this marked the beginning of the Sertorian War. This battle allowed Sertorius to establish control over most of Hispania Ulterior, while the Sullan forces fell back to Hispania Citerior. At this point, Sulla and the Senate back in Rome heard about the situation, and decided to send reinforcements. These reinforcements were led by a man named Quintus Caecilius Metellius Pius, the consular partner of Sulla. In the meantime, Lucius Hirtilius, the second in command for Sertorius, began his push into Hispania Citerior. Marcus Dominius Calvinus led the Sullian response. The two armies met at Consubura, modern-day Consigliera. Again, the details are a little light, but we know that Hirtilius, likely bolstered by the fact that his army was mostly made up of locals, used guerrilla warfare to hound Calvinus all the way to the Anas River. Here, Calvinus was either killed in battle or killed by his own troops, but in any case the remaining Romans defected to Sertorius, and most of Hispania was now his for the taking. At this point, Metellius Pius finally landed in Hispania. This time Sertorius himself came out into the field of battle. Sertorius continued in Hirtilius' footsteps, and relied on the knowledge of his local warriors to conduct devastating hit-and-run and other guerrilla tactics on Metellius and his army. Metellius tried to ignore the attacks, and went about securing the loyalty of the remaining local tribes. Eventually, though, he was forced to recognize that the situation was spiraling out of control, and he was forced to call for further aid from Rome. Lucius Manilius, the governor of neighboring Transalpine Gaul, attempted to come to his aid, but was defeated by Hirtilius and was eventually forced to return to Gaul due to an attack by the Aquitani. In 78, two disasters struck Metellius. Firstly, he attempted to lay siege to Langoburgia, a town that allied to Sertorius. He did this in the hopes of showing the tribes of Hispania that Sertorius was unable to defend them, and that even with his victories in the field, he would not triumph over Rome. Sertorius, though, had some sort of informants inside Metilius's army, and was forewarned of the upcoming siege. He quickly fortified the city, and stockpiled all the food in the surrounding countryside within the city walls. Metilius was unprepared for this. He had expected to be able to raid the surrounding area and use the supplies gained from raiding to feed his men. With no hope of feeding his men, Metilius was forced to give up the siege, and retreated back to the coastline. The second disaster was that back in Rome, good old Sulla finally died. The Sullian faction was instantly thrown into chaos. There was no clear leader, and while the men back in Rome fought to decide who would step into Sulla's shoes, Metilius was left to his own devices. No help would be coming for at least the next year, and Metilius was forced to take up defensive positions near the Baetis River. Luckily for him, though, Sertorius, either not seeing the golden opportunity before him, or simply being forced to, focused on subduing the remaining Spanish tribes. This distraction allowed Metilius to survive until 76 BCE. Back in Rome, the Senate finally recognized that something serious needed to be done to put this rebellion down. They appointed Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey, as the new proconsular governor of Hispania Citerior. Pompey was given a sizable army, made up of roughly 30,000 infantry and about 1,000 cavalry, and given basically free rein to put down the rebellion. In the meantime, Sertorius received his own reinforcement in the form of Marcus Perpennia, who led the remaining army of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another rebel against Sulla. Pompey first started along the coast, with the goal of linking up with Metellus, who was still stranded further inland. The two armies met at Larium. Pompey was overconfident. He believed that his numerical superiority would win the day, and thus rushed in his preparations to give battle. Sertorius hounded Pompey's foraging parties. With each attack, the parties strayed further and further from the two camps. Eventually, the parties were far enough away that they could be comfortably attacked without alerting the main camp. This was what Sertorius had been waiting for. He sent his most well-equipped troops to attack the foraging parties. It was a massacre, and an embarrassing defeat for Pompey, who was now forced to flee. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Sertorius, though, as at around the same time, Metellus made a move of his own and managed to defeat the army meant to hold him in place. Capitalizing on this, Metellus managed to make his way to Pompey, and the two armies united together. I can't get too deep into the remaining action during the war, as frankly it deserves its own video, but the two sides continued to fight, and the balance of power swung back and forth several times over the next 2 years. Eventually, in 74 BCE, Pompey wrote to the Senate. These letters, preserved by Sallust, are actually quite fascinating, and I'll leave a link in the description to their full contents, but he essentially tells the Senate to either send him more troops and more supplies, or he will take matters into his own hands. He literally ends the letters with this quote: "So, I'm out of options, money and credit. It is up to you. Either you save the situation, or my army will come to Italy and bring the war with it. It's not what I want, but you have been warned." This frightened the hell out of Rome's elite, and they apparently funded the response themselves. Not only did Pompey receive reinforcement and new supplies, but a bounty was even offered by Metellus. Any Roman who would betray Sertorius was to be given 100 silver talents and 20,000 acres of land. Quite the reward. Rather quickly, Sertorius became quite paranoid, and began to shut his Romans out of decision-making. He even appointed local Spanish troops as his own bodyguards, replacing the Romans who had held the post previously. This all caused the Romans under him to begin to waver, and Plutarch tells us that they began to plot his downfall. The Romans also took this out on the local Spanish troops, with punishments and general treatment of the local troops becoming harsher and harsher. It's at this point we are told that Sertorius began to break down. He had become a paranoid, erratic mess who could no longer be trusted to throw a party, much less lead an army. So Perpennia, that general from earlier, invited Sertorius to a party, which he claimed was to celebrate the upcoming victory that they were sure to achieve. However, this was all just a ruse, and Perpennia, along with a few other Romans, assassinated Sertorius. At this point, the entire rebellion began to break down. Several local tribes either sued for peace with Pompey, or just simply went home. Some of the Romans that remained attempted to carry on the rebellion under Perpennia, but were quickly destroyed by Pompey. In the end, Pompey would execute Perpennia and all the men that had murdered Sertorius. The local tribes would resume their alliance and tribute with Rome, and Pompey would continue his meteoric rise in Roman political life. This war was really the end of the Sullian Wars and represented the last breath of the Marian faction. The Palmyrene Empire was a breakaway state formed in 260 during the infamous crisis of the 3rd century. The empire first started when Odenathus, the ruler of the city of Palmyra, was declared king by the local population in 260. This was after Shapur I had managed to attack the empire and actually captured the emperor Valerian. Odenathus was nominally loyal to Gallienus, the son of Valerian, but in actuality ruled as basically an independent king. Odenathus managed to push back Shapur and was given the title Governor of the East in recognition of this feat. However, Odenathus proclaimed himself King of Kings and was seemingly set to rule as an independent ruler. However, he was assassinated along with his son Herarion in 267. He was succeeded by his youngest son, Vavivalus, who was only 10 years old at the time. Vavivalus's mother, Zenobia, would be declared regent. Zenobia would work to solidify her hold on power over the next few years. Finally, in 270, she threw off the veil of loyalty and marched on Bosphora, an important local Roman city and home to the Roman governor of Arabia Petrea. She continued the march south and invaded Egypt with an army of 70,000. She quickly conquered the province and was declared Queen of Egypt. The Roman general Tenagano Probus attempted to fend off the invasion, and even managed to regain Alexandria after its conquest by Zenobia, but eventually he was besieged in Babylon, where he committed suicide after being captured by Zenobia. After this, Zenobia turned her attention northward and invaded Asia Minor, conquering as far as modern-day Ankara. In 271, Vavivalus and Zenobia both assumed the title of Augustus, and were seemingly set to control the eastern half of the empire. Sadly for Zenobia and her son, the Emperor Aurelian had come to power, and managed to calm the various crises that the empire had been torn apart by. He invaded through the Bosphorus, and conquered city after city. Aurelian would defeat Zenobia at the Battle of Ime, and then at the Battle of Emesa. Finally, in the summer of 272, at the city of Palmyra itself, Zenobia was besieged. Zenobia was defiant, and refused to surrender. Palmyra, though, was a fortress, and Aurelian and his Romans failed again and again to take the city. Eventually, Zenobia was forced to take drastic actions. She fled the city under nightfall, and headed to the east to ask Shapur and the Persians for help. But before she could make it, she was captured by Aurelian's forces. She was brought back to the emperor, and the sight of Zenobia in chains convinced the city to capitulate. Most of the high-ranking officers and leaders of Palmyra were executed, but the fate of Zenobia and her son are left vague. We are unsure if they were likewise executed or sent into some form of exile. Whatever the case, the short-lived empire was reabsorbed into the Roman Empire. Today, we mostly focus on the city of Palmyra itself, which still stands as one of the best preserved Roman cities of the period. But the empire which centered itself on the city represents a trying time in Roman history, a time where the empire very nearly fell apart. If it hadn't been for Aurelian's genius, the Palmyrene Empire may very well have become an important player in a post-Roman world. The Great Fire of Rome is a fairly popular historical event. The fire itself took place on the 18th of June in the year 64. It began near the Circus Maximus, but would quickly spread to somewhere around 70% of the city. At the time, Rome was split into 14 districts. 3 were completely decimated by the fire. A further 7 were in various states of destruction, while the other 4 managed to stay safe from the blaze. Some of Rome's most important buildings, including the House of the Vestal Virgins, Nero's Palace, Temple of Jupiter Sator, and much of the Forum, were all completely destroyed. The fire has been subject to quite a bit of speculation throughout history. However, before I get into some of the speculation, let me just say that the cause of the fire was almost certainly an accidental fire near the shops around the Circus Maximus. That blaze was exacerbated by a strong wind that came during the night that blew embers all across the city. Remember that at the time, much of Rome was not the great temples of marble or stone that we think of today. It was instead a maze of tightly packed wooden buildings. These buildings proved to be easy kindling for the fire. The fire burned continuously for 6 days, before dying down and then reigniting for a further 3. Now, let's quickly talk about the speculation and conspiracies around the fire. Nero, who was emperor at the time, is one of Rome's worst and most insane emperors. He was tyrannical, corrupt, and impulsive. That being said, he was also not in the city of Rome when the fire occurred. In fact, Nero actually quickly returned to the city upon being informed of the fire and facilitated food shipments and opened public buildings to house those who had lost their homes in the fire. He also started a fairly decent rebuilding plan in the aftermath of the fire. His urban plan is actually still visible in the city today. However, Nero was so unpopular that many Roman authors, and even Romans at the time, spread and recorded various rumors about the fire and Nero's involvement, or lack thereof. Most of these rumors center around Nero starting the fire, and then either singing or playing the lyre while the city burned. Typically, some sort of aspiration to rebuild the city in his image is included to give some sort of motive to his actions. But really, the truth is that Rome was basically destined to burn. In just the few decades previous, no less than 6 different fires had occurred in the city, with one starting in 36 in the exact same area that the Great Fire would start in. My point is that Rome at this point in time was not a well-planned city. It was an overcrowded, poorly built, and poorly maintained city. It was not a matter of if a fire would start, but a matter of when. And it just so happened that Nero was the emperor when the Great Fire started. This isn't to say that Nero wasn't a terrible ruler. He certainly was, but in this case, the Great Fire of Rome was not caused by his incompetence. Instead, it was caused by centuries of mismanagement and short-sightedness. The foreign gods of Rome refer to the fascinating practice in Roman history of adopting local and foreign gods into the Roman state religion. To give just a few examples, the god Mithra was likely adopted from Persian religion, Vesta was adopted from Lavinium, Cybele was adopted from Anatolia, and Epona was adopted from the Celts. These gods and goddesses were typically adopted in one of 2 ways. The first and oldest method was through evocatio. In this ritual, the Roman consul or some other high-ranking official would journey to a conquered city where they would beseech and welcome the main deity of the city to follow them back to Rome. Typically, this would involve carrying the statues and other ceremonial goods of the god or goddess back to Rome, where they would be placed in a new temple. This method was much more common in the early history of Rome, especially during the conquest of the various Italic tribes. The second method by which these gods could be brought into Roman religion was essentially cultural assimilation. The Romans were actually fairly open to other religions. Oftentimes, the Romans would associate local deities with their own. For instance, Solis was a Celtic goddess of healing and water. The Romans associated her with Minerva, and a local cult, called the cult of Solis Minerva, was established and flourished around the area of modern-day Bath in England. Sometimes, such as in the cases of Cybele, these gods and goddesses would be accepted almost in their entirety. There were outliers, of course, most famously the Druids, but on the whole, we actually see the Romans adopt quite a few local deities into the Roman religion, albeit as a sort of aspect of a native Roman deity. Majorian was born sometime around the year 420. His family was heavily involved in the military aristocracy of the Western Roman Empire. His grandfather had been in charge of the Roman troops present in Illyria, while his father was the personal accountant and senior officer under Aetius. Aetius was quite possibly the most powerful general in the Western Roman Empire. He was the man tasked with holding off the barbarians, and because of that, he was afforded quite a bit of autonomy and resources. In fact, Aetius would actually go on to be remembered as one of the last great Romans of the Western Empire. It was under Aetius that Majorian would start his military career. Majorian would follow Aetius to Gaul, where he would distinguish himself in several battles, and he became a noted cavalry commander under Aetius during this time, so much so that the emperor of the time, Valentinian III, considered marrying his daughter to Majorian, something that normally would not be so important, but in this case Valentinian had no sons, only 2 daughters. Because of this, Majorian would have likely become his heir. However, Aetius had his own plans, and wanted Valentinian's daughters married to his own sons, thus securing the throne for Aetius' line. Majorian was thus expelled from Aetius' staff, and for several years he was out of the public eye entirely. But in 454, Majorian was called back into service by Valentinian himself. Aetius had been executed by Valentinian, and Valentinian hoped that Majorian would be able to calm the troops that were previously under Aetius's command. This didn't really work, and just a year later, Valentinian was murdered by several former officers that had served under Aetius. Because there was no direct male heir, a succession fight followed. Majorian was a candidate for the office of emperor, but would be outmaneuvered by a man named Petronius Maximus, a senator who had been involved in murdering Valentinian. Despite being beaten to the post of emperor, Majorian would be married to Licinia Eudoxia, the widow of Valentinian, and promoted to commander-in-chief of the imperial guard. He was essentially made the second in command of the Western Empire. Petronius would die just a few weeks into his reign, when the Vandals sacked Rome itself. At first, a man named Avitus was appointed as emperor. Avitus was a Gallic Roman noble who held the support of several of the powerful Gothic groups of the empire. At first, Majorian seemingly accepted the new emperor, but in just a few months, Avitus would be dead at the hands of Majorian, and the empire was once again without an emperor. This time, the Western Empire looked to the east to name a successor. This was halted, though, with the death of the Eastern Emperor, Marcian, in 457. His successor, Leo I, seemingly wanted to rule the empire on his own, and so did not appoint a Western Roman emperor. Instead, Majorian was appointed to his old post, and the two empires settled into an odd stalemate. Majorian was obviously the most popular person in the West, but Leo had his mind set on ruling the empire as a united entity, and thus was reluctant to appoint Majorian as emperor. The stalemate would be broken just a few months later, when a small troop of Alemanni invaded northern Italy. Majorian dispatched some soldiers to deal with the group, and upon their victory, Majorian was held as emperor by the army. This story is a little bit suspect, as it all seems just a bit too convenient, but whatever the case, by December of 457, Majorian was clearly declared the emperor, and assumed full command of the West. Interestingly though, Leo I apparently never recognized his rule, as all of the eastern sources from the time refer to Leo as the sole consul and ruler of the empire. But this was really just on paper, as in practice it was clear that Majorian was the ruler of the West. The first thing Majorian had to deal with was the invasion of Italy by a group of Vandals. The group landed in Campania sometime during the summer of 457, and began to pillage the surrounding countryside. The details are pretty light, but we know that Majorian engaged the Vandals somewhere near the coast, and apparently followed the group all the way to their ships before killing the commander personally and retaking all the loot that the Vandals had managed to pillage in Campania. After this, Majorian turned to strengthening the Roman presence in Italy. First, he passed a law, seemingly giving Romans the right to have their own weapons. This was something that Valentinian had already started, and was done in the hopes that rural Romans would have some sort of defense against future Vandal raids. Secondly, he undertook a massive recruitment drive among the barbarian mercenary groups. In fact, the list of groups he recruited from is practically a who's who of famous barbarian groups. You have the Huns, the Scythians, the Alans, the Ostrogoths, and many more. They were all recruited to serve as border guards for Italy. Lastly, he also began the restoration of at least 2 different fleets that had fallen into disrepair over the past few centuries. After Italy was secured, Majorian turned his attention to Gaul. Gaul had refused to recognize Majorian as emperor, ever since the news of Avitus's death had reached the province. Remember, Avitus was of Gallic nobility, and seemingly quite popular in the province. It's a little unclear just what the province was doing in response. While we know they did not recognize Majorian, it seems like they didn't appoint a direct competitor either. Instead, it seems they appealed to Leo over in the Eastern Empire. This was probably an attempt to provoke a civil war, which would have certainly resulted in the defeat of Majorian. The East at this point was far, and I mean far, more powerful than the West. However, we have no record of Leo ever really responding, so these attempts were seemingly unsuccessful. In the latter half of 458, Majorian personally led an army out of Italy, seemingly made up of mostly barbarian units, into Gaul. He defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Our Lady, so bad that they were forced to agree to a humiliating treaty. The Visigoths would give up all their conquests and claims to Hispania, and would return to foederati status, essentially a vassal kingdom. Majorian then moved to the north of Gaul, and using both his barbarian mercenaries and the newly vassalized Visigoths, re-established control over the region. Majorian knew that he needed to be careful in the region. if he was too heavy-handed, he risked another rebellion as soon as his own army left. So Majorian chose the path of reconciliation instead of punishment. He appointed the son-in-law of Avitus as his representative for the province, and apparently granted several tax remissions to the larger cities in the area. This seemingly calmed the province enough that Majorian felt confident in leaving the immediate area. He turned his attention south, towards Hispania. Hispania had been conquered by the previously mentioned Visigoths following the Vandal sack of Rome in 455. The Visigoths claimed this was in the name of Avitus, but in actuality it was the Visigoths who controlled the land, and the Romans were shut out of the area. This changed, of course, with the defeat of the Visigoths by Majorian. Majorian hoped to use the area as a springboard for his eventual conquest of Africa, a province that had been in the past extremely important in feeding the Western Empire, but had been out of Roman control for a few decades at this point. The details are, again, relatively light, but we know that Majorian himself led a quick campaign across Hispania, conquering most of the old province in about a year. Although he likely didn't face much in the way of resistance. Remember that Hispania had been core territory of Rome for centuries at this point, so they likely were pretty okay with Rome coming back into the picture. The Vandals, who controlled Africa, were extremely nervous at the prospect of a Roman invasion, and sent several emissaries to Majorian, but they were all rejected. However, just as Majorian was preparing to launch his invasion, his fleet was destroyed at anchor by a force of traders. It's not made clear just who these traders were, but it's fairly likely they were one of the barbarian groups. I mean, mercenaries aren't really all that loyal. With no ships, or at least not enough ships, Majorian was forced to abandon his planned conquest, and he returned to Italy. Sadly though for Majorian, he would never reach Rome again. He was intercepted by Ricimer, a Germanic Roman general who had served as Magister Militum, or Master of the Soldiers, for both Majorian and Avitus. Ricimer had gathered the old Roman aristocracy around him while Majorian was away on campaign. To understand this, we should quickly discuss Majorian's domestic policy. Majorian was at heart a reformer, but he was also cognizant of the fact that he could only remain in power with the support of the influential Roman elite. Trying to balance the two things was an act of near impossibility. For instance, in one of his laws, Majorian forgave the past due taxes of all landowners, something that likely would have been popular with all of the aristocracy. But, at the same time, he forbade public administrators from collecting taxes themselves, something that had been abused by the wealthy and powerful for quite literally centuries. Instead, it was now up to the governors to collect taxes, and who appointed those governors but the emperor. Majorian was playing a tightrope, and he had seemingly pulled too far towards reform, as on the 2nd of August in 461, Majorian was deposed and arrested by Ricimer with the support of the Italian aristocracy. After being arrested, he would be beaten and tortured for 5 days before he was beheaded. Most sources say that he never received a proper burial. At the same time, Ricimer spread a rumor that he had died from natural causes, and after a mourning period of 3 months, Ricimer facilitated the appointment of Livius Severus, a senator of no real importance. However, Majorian's generals in Gaul, Sicily, Illyria, and Hispania refused to recognize the new emperor, and a new series of civil wars would follow. Majorian represents something of a bright spot in the late history of the Western Empire. At the time of his birth, the empire was crumbling. Nobles fought over power in Italy, while barbarians invaded both the provinces and even Italy itself. When he came to power, the Western Empire was essentially just Italy, and honestly you could probably even really say that the empire was just northern Italy, from about Rome and Campania to around Aquileia and Milan in the north. Yet, by his death, Majorian had managed to not only fortify Italy, but regain, at least in name, control over Gaul, Hispania, Sicily, and Illyria, something that would have been unimaginable at the time of his birth. One can only wonder what would have happened to the West if Majorian had lived, but it certainly would have been a whole lot better than what happened under Ricimer. Perhaps we would have seen a renaissance of sort in the West, and Majorian would have been remembered as a second coming of Aurelian, a second Restitutor Orbis, but we will never know. This is probably the first question that many of you ever thought about in Roman history. Why did Rome fall? So, it probably seems a bit odd for the question to be this low on the iceberg, but really the reason this question is so low is the simple fact that there is no correct answer, or at least there is not a single correct answer. What caused the fall of the empire is probably the most complicated question you can ask in Roman history. In front of you is a non-exhaustive list of possible causes. And the truth is that all of these things caused the fall of the empire. It was not one simple factor, or one decision, or even a series of decisions that led the empire to fall. Instead, it was a combination of years of mismanagement, overextension, natural disasters, infighting, plagues, and frankly any other thing you want to mention that slowly but surely sucked the life out of one of the greatest empires in world history. It's a fascinating fall, and something that we will certainly cover in future episodes. But in my humble and fairly quick opinion, I think there are really 3 or maybe 4 things we can look at as the leading causes of the collapse. Firstly, the Antonine and the Cyprian plagues have to be considered any time you look at the fall of the empire. The Antonine in particular was extremely destructive. Not only did 5 to 10 million people, or about 10% of Rome's population, die during the plague, but it was also particularly devastating among the Roman army. In fact, it was so devastating that many contemporary historians note that the plague nearly destroyed the standing Roman army. It was so deadly that Marcus Aurelius was forced to recruit gladiators and slaves into his army, something that practically destroyed the vaunted Roman discipline. This would also be the start of Rome's reliance on mercenaries, something that would prove to be a decisive factor in the fall of Rome. The plague also destroyed the economy of the empire and resulted in mass starvation among much of the urban populations of the empire. Secondly, we must look at the crises of the 3rd century. I am cheating a little bit here as this includes quite a few events, but I think it's fairly obvious. Basically an entire century of civil war, disease, famine, and economic collapse would ruin just about any polity. I talk more extensively about this in a previous episode, but it really cannot be overstated just how debilitating this century was for the empire. In fact, I would argue this was really the point where the empire began its final decline. Thirdly, the mass migration of barbarian groups into the empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries certainly strained an already fragile political and economic system. These peoples not only warred with Rome, but also sought to carve out their own kingdoms within traditionally Roman provinces. One needs only look at the Visigoths or the Vandals to realize the impact these groups had on an already struggling Western Roman Empire. Lastly, we should really remember the time span we're talking about here. Remember, the traditional founding of Rome is said to be 753 BCE. The Roman kingdom lasted until 509 BCE, and then the Roman Republic lasted until 27 BCE. That alone is a span of some 700 years. The empire then lasted from 27 until the fall of the West in 476 AD. But even after that, the East continued to exist until 1453. We're talking about a period of about 1,000 years, and over 2,000 if you include the eastern half. I say all this to point out that Rome held on for a long fucking time. To put that into perspective, the United States has existed as an independent nation for about 247 years. We're not talking about a drop in the bucket. I think a lot of the time we lose sight of just how long Rome actually existed, and frankly, how long it dominated Europe, Northern Africa, and even the Middle East. Rome was a powerhouse for 1,000 years. Its fall was virtually guaranteed by that fact alone. The sacred chickens of Rome mainly refer to the roost of chickens kept by the augurs of Rome. It was said that the chickens' eating behaviors could be used to predict the future. Because of this, many prominent Roman statesmen would, and I think this is frankly hilarious, consult the chickens for insight into future events. One of the most famous accounts of the chickens being used concerns Publius Claudius Pulcher, a Roman commander during the First Punic War. It was said that Pulcher consulted the chickens for approval for his plan to launch a surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet. The chickens were apparently not eating, and this was an extremely bad omen. Pulcher responded by saying, quote, "Since they do not want to eat, let them drink." He would then toss the chickens into the sea. Which is actually one of the best ways to respond to a bad omen that I can think of. He would go on to launch his surprise attack, which was a complete disaster, and resulted in the near annihilation of the entire Roman fleet. Pulcher was humiliated, and most sources suggest he was exiled for his actions. There are several more stories about the chickens scattered throughout Roman history, but it is clear that they held a level of respect and reverence among not only the priestly class of Rome, but also the normal people and the aristocracy. We don't know exactly what happened to this tradition, nor when it died out, but it is an interesting aspect of Roman history that I think a lot of people probably know next to nothing about. It's also particularly amusing to think about something like this happening in the modern day. Just imagine Joe Biden or Donald Trump consulting a group of chickens to try and guide American foreign policy. Although, to be honest, it would probably work out quite a bit better than what's currently happening. So if anyone watching has an inside link to the White House, maybe drop a few suggestions. I would happily serve as the augur, and I'm sure I can get us some chickens. Just name the time and the place. Sino-Roman relations refer to the contact and trade of goods between the Roman Empire and the various Chinese dynasties of the time, primarily the Han dynasty. These were mostly indirect contacts that started around the 2nd century BCE. By this time in Roman history, the existence of China was known, at least vaguely. China was often confused with India, and it was mostly just known as the place where silk came from. Most of this knowledge came from merchants, as they were really the only people who made the long journeys. It seems that the first real attempt at contact between the two governments occurred in 166, when an envoy from Rome reached China. Before I talk about it, I should note here that it's pretty heavily debated if this was an actual envoy sent by the emperor, either Antoninus Pius or Marcus Aurelius, or simply a group of merchants. But it certainly represents the start of a more in-depth contact between the two empires. The contact would increase as the centuries passed, and by the time of the Byzantine Empire, the two empires were certainly fully aware of each other. And really that's the extent of provable contact between the two countries. Mostly, it was just a trade relationship. However, one interesting and hotly debated theory is that of the men of Liquan. The theory mainly comes from the Roman prisoners of the Battle of Carrhae, a battle fought by Marcus Licinius Crassus, and a battle that Rome would decisively lose. Following the battle, about 10,000 prisoners were taken by the Parthians to Marginia, a province in modern-day Turkmenistan. These prisoners were apparently told to man the frontier, and then just completely disappear from the historical record. The theory here goes that these men would eventually enter into the service of a man named Zhishi, and eventually settle down at a village that would come to be known as Liquan. But this theory is highly speculative, and requires several assumptions that do not have any archaeological or concrete evidence, and so it is mostly rejected by modern historians. So, in the end, Rome and China were really only indirectly in contact, and mostly this was a simple trading relationship. This theory is mostly based around the simple fact that much of the sourcing for the early history of Rome is based around men like Livy. These historians, in air quotes, were not only writing about a period of history that happened hundreds of years before they were even born, but were also deeply biased in Rome's favor, something that demonstrably led to Livy, shall we say, exaggerating certain events in Rome's history. Further, many of these sources are supposedly based on works that we simply have no record of. Because of this, we cannot properly investigate or critique these sources. I really have a hard time with this issue. Primary sources, or at least contemporary secondary sources, are vital in documenting history. But the truth is that we simply do not have these sources for the early history of Rome. It is really only after the First Punic War that we start to have any sort of contemporary writings, and even those are fragmented. I think my thoughts on the subject are really that Livy and others like him must be read with a careful eye. We cannot take his account at face value. We must look for archaeological evidence, cross-check what sources we do have with each other, and try to look past the obvious Roman bias to try and find the real history. I feel like I am being a bit harsh here, so let me just say that I am a fan of Livy. I find his works to be immensely fascinating, and his writings are some of the most important that we have on early Rome. In fact, in a lot of cases, they are all we have. So we certainly cannot dismiss these writings out of hand, and nor should we. There is real history in Livy's work, but there is also some, shall we say, fabrications. We really must be careful when reading works like Livy's Ab Urbi Condata, as simply believing the book at face value can lead to our understanding of history being flawed. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments. Well, that's it. And for all one or two of you still watching, thanks for making it this far. This series started on the day this channel hit 1,000 subs, something I thought would never happen. It was supposed to be about a month long, and instead it evolved into a months-long journey that saw me learn a lot about video making, but also kind of made me discouraged. I love Roman history. I've dedicated most of my life to reading and learning about it, and it's incredible to me that any of you would listen to me talk about it. But I also discovered on this series that I really like digging deep into Roman history. I don't really like this surface level stuff, if you can call what I just did surface level. After all, it's over 4 hours long, but I digress. So in the future, I'm going to stick to one subject videos. I like them more, I think they're more entertaining, and it is easier for me to make them. Plus, it's a whole hell of a lot more motivating. I thank you all for watching. It really means the world to me. So, thank you all, and here's to more videos in the future. Peace.